So there's a number in your head right now for how much money would be enough. And you're wrong about it. Not the number, what you think it would do to you. Here's a man called Ronald Reed. Vermont. He fixed cars at a gas station for 25 years, then swept floors at JCPenney. He patched his coat with safety pins. He died in 2014 and left $8 million. Same year, a man called Richard Foscone. Harvard, Merrill Lynch executive, retired in his 40s. An 11,000 square foot house with 2 elevators and an indoor pool. The house was foreclosed. He went bankrupt. Here's what nobody tells you. The janitor didn't beat the executive on intelligence. He didn't have better information. He had worse. Doing well with money has almost nothing to do with how smart you are, and almost everything to do with how you behave. And behavior is hard to teach, even to very smart people. So here's the whole book. Every chapter in Housel's own order, all 20 of them. Plus, at the end, the honest part, the one thing this book cannot give you, no matter how many times you quote it. It starts with the fact that nobody is crazy. Chapter 1. No one's crazy. So there's an argument you've had. Maybe not out loud, but you've had it. Someone in your family buys lottery tickets, 20 quid a week, maybe more. And you know the maths. Everyone knows the maths. The maths is insulting. You've probably even said it out loud at some point, in that particular voice people use when they're being helpful. You do know the odds on that, right? And they nod. Because of course they know, and they buy them anyway. Or it's the opposite. It's your uncle who won't put a penny in the stock market. Not a penny, not in a pension, not in an index fund, nothing. It sits in a savings account earning almost nothing and losing to inflation every single year. And you've explained compound interest to him roughly 9 times, and he says, I just don't trust it. And that's the end of the conversation. And you walk away thinking, that's mad. That's just objectively, mathematically mad. Here's Housel's first move, and it's the one that quietly runs underneath the whole rest of the book. They're not mad. Nobody is. Let me give you the number, because the number is genuinely startling. Housel says your personal experience with money makes up maybe 0.000000001% of what's happened in the world with money, and maybe 80% of how you think the world works. Read that again. 80% of your entire financial worldview is built from a sample so small it rounds to nothing. And it's not because you're stupid. It's because you were there. You felt it. Everything else is a chart. So watch what that does to 2 people. Take stocks. If you were born in 1970, the S&P 500 went up almost 10-fold, adjusted for inflation during your teens and 20s. 10-fold. If you were born in 1950, the market went, and this is adjusted for inflation, literally nowhere during your teens and 20s. 2 groups of people, same country, same market, 20 years apart. One of them learned in their bones that stocks make you rich. The other learned in their bones that stocks are a con. Now put those 2 people in a room and ask them to agree on a pension. They can't. And neither of them is being irrational. They're both doing exactly what a sensible person does, which is to trust the thing they lived through over the thing someone told them. Same with inflation. If you grew up in 1960s and 70s America, prices roughly tripled in your formative years. Tripled. You watched your parents' money get quietly eaten. If you were born in 1990, inflation has been so low for so long that it's basically never been a thing you had to think about until very recently. One of those people keeps cash. One of them thinks keeping cash is stupid. Both of them are describing the world accurately. The world they got. And here's where it stops being an interesting fact and starts being about you. Housel makes the point that this isn't a story about old people being stuck in their ways. It's about all of us, right now, including you, including me. There is no version of this where you're the one who sees clearly. Your view of money is a photograph taken from exactly one seat in the stadium, and you have never once seen the pitch from anywhere else. Now, the lottery tickets. There's a statistic in this chapter that I found genuinely hard to sit with. The lowest income households in America spend, on average, over $400 a year on lottery tickets. $400, and separately, 40% of Americans can't come up with $400 in an emergency. So the people buying the most tickets are, broadly, the people who could least afford the ticket and most need the $400. And your instinct, my instinct, is to call that a tragedy of financial illiteracy. Teach them the odds, run a campaign. But listen to how Housel imagines it from the inside. These are people who live paycheck to paycheck. Saving is out of reach. The prospects of a much better life, a holiday, a new car, health insurance, a safe neighborhood, are so far away that they may as well be fiction. They are buying a dream, and it is the only place in their entire budget where a dream is even available. You're not buying a ticket. You already have the dream. You've got it in a pension, in a mortgage, in a job with a ladder. You have somewhere to put hope. They're buying the only hope on the shelf they can afford. That is not a stupid decision. That is a rational purchase of an emotion that you happen to get for free. And I want to be careful here, because this is where this chapter gets misused. Housel is not saying every financial decision is fine. Some are genuinely terrible. He's saying something narrower and harder. That people are not making decisions on a spreadsheet. They're making them at a kitchen table, at a specific moment in history, with the specific set of scars they've got, and every one of those decisions makes sense to the person making it in that moment. Including yours. Especially yours. So here's the question I keep coming back to. Who in your life do you think is being irrational with money? Go on, you've got someone. The brother who won't invest. The friend who leases a car she obviously can't afford. The parent who keeps everything in cash under a mattress mentality. You've got a whole file on them. Now, what happened to them that didn't happen to you? Because I'd bet you've never asked. I'd bet you've explained. I'd bet you've sent them an article. But you have never once sat down and asked what money did to them when they were 19. And that's the thing that makes this the right first chapter, and it's why it links straight back to the last book we did on this channel. Carnegie spent 30 chapters saying, the other person has reasons you cannot see, and almost everything that goes wrong between two people goes wrong because one of them forgot that. Housel is saying the exact same thing and pointing it at money. Nobody's crazy. Everybody's just standing somewhere you've never stood. Which brings us to the uncomfortable follow-up. And it's chapter 2. Because if where you were standing determines what you learned, then somebody had to put you there. And you didn't choose it. Chapter 2. Luck and Risk. So imagine you're 13 years old in 1968 and your school buys a computer. That doesn't sound like much. Let me tell you what it actually was. In 1968, there were roughly 300 million high school-age people in the world. About 18 million of them were in the United States. About 270,000 of those lived in Washington state. And about 100,000 of those were in the Seattle area. And of those, roughly 300 attended Lakeside School. Lakeside had a computer. In 1968, universities didn't have computers as good as the one this school had, because a group of mothers held a rummage sale and spent $3,000 on a teletype terminal hooked up to a mainframe. Housel's arithmetic on this is brutal. One in roughly every million high school-age people in the world got that machine. Bill Gates was one of them. And Gates has said it himself plainly. If there had been no Lakeside, there would have been no Microsoft. Now. Everything after that, the obsession, the 8,000 hours, the dropping out, the ruthlessness, the decades of work. That's all real. Nobody handed Bill Gates Microsoft. He earned it in a way almost nobody would be willing to. But the door he walked through, one in a million people got to stand in front of. And here's the part of this chapter that took the top of my head off. There was a second kid at Lakeside, Kent Evans. Gates' best friend. By all accounts, every bit as good with computers, every bit as driven. The two of them ran the school's class scheduling system together. Gates has said Evans would have been a full partner at Microsoft. Kent Evans died in a mountaineering accident before he finished high school. And there was a third kid, Paul Allen. You know his name because he lived. 3 boys in the same room, with the same one-in-a-million machine, with the same talent. One became one of the richest men in history. One founded Microsoft alongside him. One died on a mountain at 17. Housel's line is that the odds of Lakeside having a computer and the odds of dying in a mountaineering accident are roughly the same. 1 in a million, both ways. Same force, different direction. That's the whole chapter, and it's this. Luck and risk are siblings. They are both the reality that every outcome in life is guided by forces other than individual effort. They are the same thing wearing different faces, and you cannot believe in one without believing in the other. And you don't. Neither do I. That's the problem, because watch what we actually do. When someone succeeds, we write a book about their habits. We interview them about their morning routine. We take the whole outcome and reverse engineer it into a set of decisions, and we assume the decisions cause the outcome. When someone fails, we say they made bad choices. We are extremely comfortable saying risk about the failure and almost never saying luck about the success. And if you doubt that, notice how you feel when someone suggests that your success had a lot of luck in it. Notice the little flare of irritation. I get it too. It feels like being robbed of something. Housel makes a point I want to sit on for a second. He says nobody wants to say successful people are lucky, partly out of politeness, but mostly because assessing luck is genuinely hard. So we do something easier and much dumber. We assume effort explains everything, and we get the world wrong in a way that costs us. Because if you believe success is a pure function of effort, then you will copy the wrong people, and you will judge yourself against outcomes you had no access to. Now let me flip it to the other side, which is the side that's actually about you. Cornelius Vanderbilt. He built a railroad empire by repeatedly, openly breaking the law. His own attorneys told him a set of deals were illegal, and he said, roughly, "You don't suppose you can run a railroad in accordance with the statutes of the state of New York, do you?" That reads as swagger. That reads as the great man ignoring small rules. And it worked, so we call it boldness. Then there's Enron. Same behavior, different outcome, and now we call it fraud. Housel's point isn't that Vanderbilt was secretly good or Enron was secretly fine. It's that from the inside, at the time, the same reasoning produced both. And only the result tells you which word to use afterwards. Which brings us to Rajat Gupta, and this is the story that lands hardest. Gupta was orphaned as a teenager in Kolkata. He climbed all the way to running McKinsey, one of the most prestigious companies in the world. He retired, sat on the boards of Goldman Sachs and Procter & Gamble, worked with the UN, co-founded a business school. He was worth $100 million, and he wanted to be a billionaire. So in 2008, in a Goldman Sachs board meeting, he heard that Warren Buffett was about to invest $5 billion into the bank during the worst of the crisis. 16 seconds after that call ended, Gupta was on the phone to a hedge fund manager who bought 175,000 Goldman shares. He went to prison. A man with $100 million destroyed everything he had ever built, from the orphanage upwards, because $100 million wasn't enough. Now here's the honest bit, and it's the one that makes this chapter usable instead of just interesting. You cannot separate luck from risk in your own life. You can't. Nobody can. The line is genuinely invisible from the inside. So Housel gives two rules, and they're both about aiming lower and holding looser. First, be careful who you praise and admire, and be careful who you look down on. Not don't have role models, but stop studying the extremes. The outliers at both ends are the ones where luck and risk did the most work, and they are exactly the ones we build our stories from. Look instead at the broad patterns. What generally works for most people, most of the time, is a far better teacher than what worked spectacularly once for one man in Seattle. Second, focus less on specific individuals and more on broad patterns. Nobody has ever done a good job of guessing which specific person will get rich. Everybody can see that patience and saving and not blowing up tend to work. And then there's the line that I think is the real gift of this chapter, and it cuts both ways. Nothing is as good or as bad as it seems. Not the success you're jealous of, not the failure you're ashamed of. So the question. Think about the thing in your financial life you're proudest of. The house, the job, the business, the decision you got right. How much of it was you? Not none of it. Don't do that thing where you swing to false modesty, because that's just as inaccurate, and it lets you off the hook of taking responsibility for what actually was you. But how much of it, genuinely, was a machine that a group of mothers happened to buy at a rummage sale 1 year before you walked into the room? And if you're honest about that number for your own wins, you might have to be honest about it for other people's losses, which is uncomfortable, and it's the whole reason the next chapter exists, because Gupta's problem wasn't luck or risk at all. His problem was that he had $100 million, and he still hadn't reached the one thing this book keeps circling: enough. Chapter 3. Never Enough. So there's a party on Shelter Island, and two writers are standing in a very expensive house. One of them is Kurt Vonnegut, the other is Joseph Heller, who wrote Catch-22. And Vonnegut points out to his friend that the man hosting this party, a hedge fund manager, made more money in a single day than Heller earned from Catch-22 over the entire history of the book. Catch-22, one of the most famous novels of the 20th century, beaten in a day. And Heller says, yes, but I have something he will never have: enough. Now, I want to be careful, because that line has been on a lot of posters, and putting it on a poster is exactly how you avoid dealing with it. So let's deal with it. Here's Rajat Gupta again from the last chapter, $100 million, and it wasn't enough, and he went to prison for insider trading. And here's Bernie Madoff, who people forget was not a fraud who got rich. He was rich first. His legitimate market-making business, the real one, the legal one, was making $80 to $100 million a year. 80 to 100 million. A year, legally. And he ran the largest Ponzi scheme in history alongside it. Housel's question is the only sane one. What on earth was that for? These are not stupid men. Gupta climbed out of an orphanage in Kolkata to the top of McKinsey. Madoff built a genuinely successful firm. These are people with more skill, more discipline, and more raw ability than almost anyone listening to this, and they risked absolutely everything they had for something they did not need. And that tells you the skill they were missing is not intelligence, It's a different skill entirely, and almost nobody teaches it. Housel calls it this: the hardest financial skill is getting the goalpost to stop moving. Because here's what actually happens, and it happens to you and it happens to me. You get the raise, and for about 3 weeks it's wonderful. And then it isn't a raise anymore, it's just your salary. It's just the number. And now the interesting number is the next one. That's not greed exactly. It's something more mechanical than greed. Modern capitalism is extremely good at 2 things: generating wealth and generating envy. And the goalpost moves not because you're a bad person, but because the people around you moved, so you moved. And the whole thing slides sideways forever. And the deadly part, the part that turns this from a philosophical problem into a bankruptcy, is that when the goalpost keeps moving, you keep taking risk to catch it, and eventually you take a risk that ends you. So Housel gives 4 things, and I find these unusually practical for a chapter that's essentially about the soul. 1. The hardest financial skill is getting the goalpost to stop moving. If expectations rise with results, there is no logic in striving for more, because you'll feel exactly the same after putting in extra effort. That's the trap. You are running toward a line that moves at your speed. 2. Social comparison is the problem, and this is the one that gets me. Think of the ladder. A rookie baseball player earning $500,000 looks up at the star on $20 million. The star on $20 million looks up at the top 10 who make 40. The top 10 look at a hedge fund manager making 100 times that. The hedge fund manager looks at Warren Buffett, whose income in 2018 was $4 billion. Every single person on that ladder, everyone, has someone above them, including the man at the top, who is being compared to some future richer person who doesn't exist yet. Housel's line is that the only way to win a game with no finish line is to refuse to play. And I think most of us hear that and nod and then immediately go and check what someone else is earning. 3. Enough is not too little. This is the one people get wrong. Enough is not a philosophy of settling, or of poverty being noble, or of you deserving less. It's the opposite. It's the realization that an insatiable appetite for more will push you to the point of regret. And the person who says, "This is enough," is not giving up. They are refusing a bet with terrible odds. 4. There are many things never worth risking, no matter the potential gain. Reputation, freedom, family and friends. Being loved by people you want to love you. Happiness, and the rule Housel gives is the sharpest sentence in the chapter. The best way to keep these things is to know when it's time to stop taking risks that might harm them. Now here's my honest problem with all of this. And I'll say it because I don't think this chapter is quite as easy as it reads. Have enough is very easy advice to give and almost impossible to act on, because nobody knows their number. If I ask you what enough is, you will either say something vague and virtuous, or you'll name a figure that is, be honest, noticeably higher than what you have now. That's not hypocrisy. That's just how the mechanism works. The goalpost is not a decision you make once. It's a thing you have to catch in the act, repeatedly, forever. So I don't think the useful question is, what's your number? I think it's this. When was the last time you got something you'd wanted for a long time? The money, the job, the thing. And how long did the feeling last? Not how good was it? How long? Because if the answer is about a fortnight, then you already have all the evidence you need that the next one will also last about a fortnight. You've run the experiment. You've run it several times, and knowing that, honestly, is worth more than any number. Which sets up the next chapter, because if enough is about knowing when to stop, chapter 4 is about the one thing where stopping is the single worst move you can make, and where almost everybody, including me, gets the maths embarrassingly wrong. Chapter 4. Confounding Compounding. So in the 1970s, scientists were arguing about ice ages, and they had a problem. They knew there had been ice ages. 5 of them. They could see the evidence carved into the rock. What they couldn't work out was the mechanism. Because the obvious answer, it got really, really cold, turns out to be wrong. A Serbian scientist named Milutin Milankovic worked out that it's the tilt of the Earth. But the version I want is what a later researcher, Vladimir Kirpin, added, because that's where the money is. It isn't brutal cold that causes an ice age. It's a mildly cool summer. That's it. It starts with a winter where not all the snow melts. The leftover snow makes it easier for more snow to gather the next winter, because ice reflects sunlight, which lowers the temperature, which means more leftover snow, which reflects more sunlight. And you run that loop for a few thousand years, and you have a continent under a sheet of ice miles thick. There was no catastrophe. There was a summer that was slightly less warm than it needed to be, and then time did the rest. Now hold that, and look at Warren Buffett. Buffett's net worth, when Housel wrote this, was $84.5 billion. $84.2 billion of it was accumulated after his 50th birthday. $81.5 billion came after he qualified for Social Security in his 60s. Read that again. Roughly 96% of Warren Buffett's wealth arrived after the age most people are winding down. And here's the thought experiment that makes the point unarguable. Buffett started seriously investing at 10. Suppose instead he'd been a normal kid, messing about until 22, then getting into investing after a bit of college and a job. And suppose he still earned the extraordinary annual returns he actually earned, and suppose he retired at 60 like a normal person. What would he be worth? Not $84 billion. Housel runs the numbers, roughly $12 million. $12 million instead of $84 billion. Same skill, same returns, same man. He just started 12 years later and stopped 30 years earlier. 99.9% of Warren Buffett's fortune is not explained by his investing ability at all. It's explained by the fact that he has been doing it since he was a child and never stopped. His skill is investing, his secret is time. And this is where Housel does something I love, which is to name the person nobody names. There is an investor called Jim Simons who runs Renaissance Technologies. Since 1988, he has compounded money at 66% annually. Buffett's number is about 22%. Nobody in the history of recorded markets is close to Simons. He is, by a wide margin, the better investor. Simons is worth $21 billion. Buffett is worth $84. The better investor has a quarter of the money. Why? Because Simons didn't find his stride until he was 50. He's had less than half the compounding years. If Simons had Buffett's timeline, Housel points out the number becomes absurd. It exceeds the wealth of the entire planet. So, good investing isn't about earning the highest returns. It's about earning pretty good returns you can stick with for the longest period of time. That's when compounding runs riot. Now, why doesn't everybody just do that? Because compounding is not intuitive. It is genuinely structurally hard for a human brain to feel. Try it. What's 8 plus 8 plus 8? 8 times. You can do that in your head. 64. What's 8 times 8 times 8? 8 times. It's about 16 million. Your brain is a linear machine living in an exponential world. And it doesn't upgrade just because you learned the formula. Even the Ice Age scientists did it. They went looking for a catastrophic cause because the result was catastrophic, and the actual cause was a slightly mild summer. We do exactly the same thing with money. We see the result, someone's rich, and we go hunting for the dramatic cause. What did they buy? What was the trade? What's the strategy? Because the outcome is huge. The cause must be huge. And then it turns out the cause was, they started early, they didn't interrupt it, and they were still there 40 years later, which is an unbearable answer. It's unbearable because there's nothing to buy, nothing to be clever about, and no way to skip ahead. All the interesting parts of investing, the picking, the timing, the being right, turn out to be a rounding error next to the boring part. So notice what actually gets rewarded here. Not the biggest returns, uninterrupted returns. Which means the entire game quietly becomes about not stopping, not blowing up, not panicking, not needing the money at the wrong moment, not having to sell. And that reframes what looks like weakness. Being merely average for a very long time is not a consolation prize. It is the whole prize. It's the leftover snow. I'm not going to tell you to start investing or to buy anything, or that it's too late, because I don't know your situation and I'm not qualified and I genuinely don't care what you do with this. But I do want to leave you with the actual question, which isn't the one people usually ask. The usual question is, how do I get better returns? The question this chapter asks is, what would make you stop? What event, what panic, what emergency, what temptation would make you interrupt the thing? Because that's your real risk, not your returns, the interruption. And if you can name the thing that would make you stop, you can build around it, which is exactly what the next chapter is about. Because it turns out getting money and keeping money are two completely different skills. And almost everybody who has lost everything was very, very good at the first one. Chapter 5. Getting Wealthy versus Staying Wealthy. So it's October 1929 and a man walks through his front door. And his wife has already started crying. Her name is Dorothy Livermore. Her husband is Jesse Livermore, the greatest stock trader of his day. The market has just had one of the worst days in its history. This is the crash, the actual crash. And the news has been coming in all afternoon about traders jumping out of windows. Dorothy's father lost everything in a previous crash. She has already moved her mother into the house. She assumes they're ruined, and she is standing in the hallway working out how to tell the children. Jesse walks in and sees her face and doesn't understand. Because he'd shorted the market. He had bet the whole thing would fall, and it fell. And on that single day, Jesse Livermore made the equivalent of more than $3 billion. $3 billion. In a day. On the worst day the market had ever had. His mother told him it was the proudest day of her life. Now let me tell you about a man called Abraham Jermansky on the same day, in the same city. Multi-millionaire real estate developer, made his fortune in the roaring 20s, heavily invested in stocks. On the day of the crash, his family reported him missing. His attorney had last seen him on Wall Street, tearing up ticker tape and scattering it on the pavement. They never found him. Two men, same market, same day. One makes $3 billion, one walks into the sea. That's the setup, and now here's the ending, and the ending is the chapter. 4 years later, Jesse Livermore was bankrupt. He got bolder. He kept making bigger bets. He lost more money than he had, repeatedly, until the market humiliated him and he ran out of everything. In 1940, he took his own life. So the man who made $3 billion on the worst day in market history, the single most spectacular piece of getting wealthy in the era, could not stay wealthy for 4 years. And that's the whole idea. Getting money and keeping money are two entirely different skills. Getting money requires taking risks, being optimistic, putting yourself out there. Keeping money requires the opposite. It requires humility and fear that what you made can be taken away just as fast. It requires accepting that at least some of what you got was luck, so past success can't be relied on to repeat. You need both. And they are, in the deep sense, contradictory. The habits that make you rich are frequently the exact habits that lose it. Housel calls the necessary skill survival, and I want to be precise about what he means, because survival sounds passive, and it isn't. He points at Michael Moritz, the head of Sequoia Capital, one of the most successful venture firms that has ever existed. Somebody asked him why Sequoia has stayed on top for decades while other firms come and go. And Moritz's answer wasn't about picking better companies or being smarter. He said, "We've always been afraid of going out of business." That's it. Sequoia's edge is fear. They assume tomorrow will not be like today, so they never get comfortable, so they never bet the firm, so they're still here. And being still here for 40 years is how you catch the compounding from the last chapter. Same idea as Buffett, and Housel makes the observation that Buffett's genius is usually described wrongly. People obsess over the companies he bought. But over his career, Buffett has owned 400 or 500 stocks. He made most of his money on about 10 of them. And Charlie Munger's line about it is the honest version. They didn't get rich by being brilliant. They got rich by never being interrupted. Buffett never panicked and sold at the bottom. Never over-borrowed. Never got so leveraged that a bad year could finish him. Never quit, never retired, never burned out. He survived, and survival gave the compounding room to do its thing. So what does that mean for a normal person who is not running a hedge fund? Housel gives 3 things, and I think they're the most directly usable part of this book so far. 1, more than anything, you want to be financially unbreakable. Not to get the highest returns, those tend to be one-off hits that can't be repeated. Unbreakable, so you can stay in the game long enough for compounding to work. Those 2 words, unbreakable and staying, are doing all the labor here. 2, planning is important, but the most important part of every plan is to plan on the plan not going according to plan. Say that one slowly. Every plan you make assumes a future that will not arrive exactly as described. Room for error, a savings buffer, flexibility, not needing everything to go right, is what lets you endure long enough to get to the part where you are right. 3, a barbelled personality. Optimistic about the long run, paranoid about what will stop you getting there. Those sound contradictory, and they're not. They're the same person on 2 different timescales. The optimism is about the destination. The paranoia is about the road. Now, my honest note on this chapter. There is something slightly uncomfortable in reading advice about survival from people whose survival was already fairly well underwritten. It is much easier to be unbreakable when a bad year means a smaller bonus than when it means you can't make rent. Housel is honest about this later in the book, and I'll come back to it in the honest chapter at the end. But the underlying point survives that objection completely, and it might matter more the less you have, not less. The person who avoids ruin gets to keep playing, and the person who keeps playing eventually gets the good years too. So here's the question, and it's a nastier one than it sounds. What in your financial life could actually break you? Not what would be annoying. What would force you to sell something, or borrow at a terrible rate, or take a job you hate, or undo something you've spent years building? Because whatever that thing is, that's the one that matters. Not your returns, not your picks, the thing that could make you stop. Jesse Livermore knew everything about markets. He just never worked out what could break him, and the answer turned out to be himself. Which leads straight into Chapter 6, and Chapter 6 is the one that made me completely rethink what being right is even worth. Because it turns out you can be wrong most of the time and still win enormously, and the reason why is buried in the tales. Chapter 6, Tails, You Win. So a man called Heinz Berggruen flees Nazi Germany in 1936, ends up in America, studies literature, and eventually starts dealing art. And by the end of his life, he has one of the most extraordinary collections anyone has ever assembled: Picassos, Braques, Klees, Matisse's. In 2000, he sold a chunk of it to the German government for well over 100 million euros, which was such a low price relative to the value that it was essentially treated as a gift. And the obvious question is, how does one man keep picking the right artists for decades? Because that's how we frame it. He must have had an eye, he must have known. Here's the answer, and it's from an investment firm that studied how the great collectors work. They bought enormous quantities of art, vast amounts, and a small percentage of it turned out to be brilliant, and they held those pieces for a very long time. That's it. Most of what Berggruen bought was, by his own standards, unremarkable. It didn't matter. If you buy a huge and varied collection and 1% of it turns out to be a Picasso, the other 99% can be worth almost nothing, and you still end up with one of the great collections on Earth. He wasn't right most of the time. He was right hugely a few times. Now let's do Walt Disney, because this one is sharper. Disney produced over 400 cartoons in the 1920s and 30s. Most of them were, in business terms, disasters. His first studio went bankrupt. His films were fantastically expensive to make and financed on horrible terms. By the mid-1930s, he had produced hundreds of hours of film and lost money on essentially all of it. Then in 1938, he released Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. It made $8 million in the first 6 months. A different order of magnitude entirely. It paid off every company debt, funded a new studio, and rewrote what Disney was. 400-plus cartoons, hundreds of hours, and the 83 minutes of Snow White were, financially, all that mattered. That's a tale, an outlying, one-in-thousands event that carries everything behind it. And here's the number that made me actually stop and put the book down. The Russell 3000 Index, 3,000 American companies, has increased something like 73-fold since 1980. Enormous success. 40% of the companies in that index were, over that period, effectively total failures. Lost essentially all their value and never recovered. 40% of it was rubble. And the whole index still went up 73-fold because about 7% of the components performed so extraordinarily that they carried the entire thing on their backs. You could have been wrong about 4 out of every 10 companies you owned and still made a fortune, provided you owned the 7%. And this is the bit that I think genuinely changes how you should feel about your own decisions. Housel makes the point that if you're a good investor, you will be right maybe half the time. Maybe. The rest is you being wrong, and the money coming anyway from a small number of things going enormously right. So being wrong is not evidence that you're bad at this. Being wrong most of the time is the normal texture of a successful financial life. That's not a consolation, that's the actual mechanism. Which means the failure mode isn't being wrong. The failure mode is not being there when the tail arrives. Now let me push this further than the money, because Housel does, and it's the part people skip. Tails drive everything. Look at your own life. Think about your career, the number of days you have worked, thousands of them. Now think about how many of those days actually changed the direction of your life. A handful, 5, 3. The conversation that led to the job, the night you met someone, the one decision. Most days you did the work and nothing structural happened. That's not waste. That's the price of being present on the day that counted. Same with the news. In 2008 an enormous amount happened, but only a few days, a few hours really, determined the whole shape of what followed. Napoleon's definition of a military genius, which Housel quotes, is exactly this: the man who can do the average thing when everyone else around him is losing his mind. Not the man who is brilliant every day, the man who is ordinary on the days that don't matter and doesn't blow himself up before the days that do. So what do you actually do with this? 2 things, I think. The first is about how you judge yourself. If you have been quietly humiliated by the investments you got wrong, or the business that failed, or the years that produced nothing, that arithmetic is completely normal, and it is not a verdict on you. Berggruen bought a mountain of forgettable art. Disney made 400 cartoons nobody remembers. You are supposed to have a pile of unremarkable outcomes behind you. The second is about how you behave when things are going badly. Because if the tails are the only thing that matter, and you cannot know in advance which one it'll be, then the only strategy that works is to still be there, which is chapter 5 all over again. Survival isn't a separate virtue. It's the thing that keeps you in the room for the tail, and it makes a specific kind of behavior the enemy, quitting after a run of ordinary results. Because a run of ordinary results is not a signal. It's the default state. It's what most of the time looks like. Now, my honest reservation. Buy a lot of things and hold the winners forever is easy to say from the far side of the outcome. Berggruen bought art for decades without knowing whether any of it would be a Picasso. Disney was mortgaging everything on a film that could have finished him. From the inside, the tail strategy just feels like a long sequence of things not working. That's not a flaw in the idea. It's just the honest cost of it, and nobody who tells you this story tells you that the middle of it feels awful. So, the question: what are you currently judging yourself as a failure for? That is actually just the 93%. The business that didn't work, the years that felt like nothing, the investments that went nowhere, the projects nobody saw. Not everything that didn't work was a mistake. Some of it was just the cost of being in the room. And that leads into chapter 7, which asks what all of this compounding and surviving and waiting is even for. Because Housel has an answer, and it's not the one on the magazine covers. Chapter 7. Freedom. So here's a question that sounds simple and isn't. What is money actually for? And I don't mean the philosophical version. I mean, when you picture having more of it, what exactly is the picture? Be honest. Most of us, if we're quick about it, picture things. A house, a car, a kitchen. Not having to look at the right-hand side of the menu. Housel says that's the wrong picture, and he has research behind it, which is unusual for this book. There was a psychologist at the University of Michigan called Angus Campbell, and in 1981 he wrote a book asking a straightforward question. What actually makes people happy? He'd expected, because this was the fashion, that it would come down to the obvious demographic buckets. Rich people happier than poor. Healthy happier than sick. Married happier than single. What he found was that none of those explained it nearly as well as one thing. Here's how he put it. Having a strong sense of controlling one's life is a more dependable predictor of positive feelings of well-being than any of the objective conditions of life we have considered. Read that again. More than income, more than health, more than any of the objective conditions. Control, not the size of your life, the authorship of it. So here's Housel's claim, and it reframes the whole book. The highest dividend money pays is its ability to give you control over your time. Money's real value isn't the stuff, it's the ability to wake up and say, I can do what I want today, with whoever I want, for as long as I want. And once you look at it that way, an ordinary financial decision changes meaning completely. Savings aren't a pile of numbers you're building for later. Savings are permission. Every pound you don't need to earn this month is a little bit of your calendar bought back from someone else. Now let me show you why this doesn't feel true, even though it is. We are, by every material measure, vastly richer than people were in 1950. Bigger houses, better cars, better medicine, more of everything. Housel points out that the median American home in 1950 was smaller than what a modern family would consider cramped, and had more people living in it. And yet, happiness hasn't obviously gone up. It's flat or worse. Why? Because of what happened to the kind of work we do. In 1950, you had a lot of jobs where a man operated a machine, and when he walked out of the building, the work stopped. Physically stopped. It was in the factory, and he wasn't. Now most of us have jobs where the product is a decision, or a judgment, or an idea. And you cannot leave those at the office. There is no gate. Housel's line is that your tool is your head, and your head goes home with you. It goes to dinner. It goes to bed. It's there at 3 in the morning turning something over. So the work got more comfortable and less confined, and the hours look fewer on paper, and yet people feel less in control than the man at the machine, because he genuinely clocked off and you never do. We gained money and lost control, and control was the thing that was doing the work. And then there's the other trap, which is the one people won't admit to. Housel tells the story of a man he worked with as a valet, a hedge fund manager, absurdly wealthy, and by every measure trapped. He had the money to do anything, and a life engineered so that he could do nothing but keep working. Housel's observation about the wealthy people he met is that a lot of them worked longer and more controlled hours than he did, on far less freedom, despite having far more money. They had bought the things. They had not bought the time. Now, the part that I think matters most for anyone who isn't wealthy. Because otherwise, this is just a chapter for rich people who feel sad. Control isn't binary. You don't unlock it at a number. Housel gives the example of Derek Sivers on what it means to be rich, having enough money to say no to things. And a smaller savings buffer isn't a lesser version of that. It's the same thing in miniature. Enough money to leave a bad job. Enough to survive a bad month without borrowing. Enough to not take the client you know is going to be a nightmare. Every one of those is a purchase of control, and every one of them is available at a much lower price than rich. And this is where the chapter gets its teeth, because it means most of us are spending our control on things instead of buying it. The car payment isn't just a car payment. It's a fixed monthly requirement to earn a certain amount, which means it's a constraint on which jobs you can take, which means it's a small ongoing sale of your future choices made in exchange for a nicer commute. That's not a moral failing. I've done it. Most people do it. But it should at least be an honest trade. You are buying an object with a currency that is not money, and the currency is your ability to say no. Now, the honest limitation, and it's a real one. Control is enormously easier to buy if you already have some. If your income barely covers your outgoings, buy freedom instead of things is not a choice you're being offered. The chapter reads a little differently depending on where you're standing, and Housel is better on this later than he is here. But even at the bottom of the ladder, the ranking holds. The first pound of savings buys more freedom per pound than any pound after it, because it's the difference between having no options and having one. So here's the question I want to leave you with, and it's the one I've actually used on myself. What did you buy in the last year that increased your control over your own time? Not what did you buy that was nice, not what did you buy that you enjoyed. What did you buy that made your next 12 months more yours? And if the honest answer is nothing, if everything you bought either cost you nothing in freedom or quietly cost you some, that's worth knowing. Not because you should feel bad about it, you shouldn't, but because you've been running an exchange rate you never actually looked at. And speaking of exchange rates you never looked at, Chapter 8 is about the exact reason we buy the things in the first place, and it's built on the most humiliating realization in this entire book. Housel gets it from a car park. Chapter 8. The Man in the Car Paradox. So you're 19, and you're parking other people's cars for a living. That's Housel in Los Angeles in the mid-2000s. And the good part of that job, the genuinely good part, is that you get to drive extraordinary machines. Ferraris, Lamborghinis, Rolls-Royces. The whole fleet comes through, and you get 30 seconds behind the wheel of each one. And he says he had the obvious dream. He wanted one. Because a car like that sends a signal, and the signal is, I made it. I'm smart. I'm rich. I have taste. I'm important. Look at me. Then he noticed something, and it's so simple that I think it's easy to miss how devastating it is. He never looked at the drivers. He'd been parking these cars for months. He'd handled hundreds of them, and when a Ferrari came past him on the street, he didn't look at the man driving it. He looked at the Ferrari. He imagined himself in it. Now hold that thought and turn it around, because this is the whole chapter. When you see someone in a beautiful car, you almost never think, wow, that guy is cool. You think, wow, if I had that car, people would think I'm cool. You are not admiring the driver. You are using the driver's car to picture yourself. Housel's line for it is exact, and I'll give it to you straight. People generally aspire to be respected and admired by others, and using money to buy fancy things may bring less of it than you imagine. Because the thing you actually want, the thing under the want, is for people to think well of you. That's the real desire. And the car is a strategy for getting it. And the strategy doesn't work, not because people are shallow, but because they are doing to you precisely what you do to them, looking straight past you at the object and inserting themselves. The car is a mirror, and you are not in it. This is one of the shortest chapters in the book, and I think that's deliberate, because there isn't much to argue with. It's an observation you can verify yourself in about a day. Try it. Next time you see something expensive, a car, a watch, a house, a coat, catch what your brain actually does in the first half second. Watch whether the thought is what an admirable person or whether it's imagine me with that. It's the second one. It's always the second one. It's the second one for me, and it's the second one for you. Now here's why it isn't just a clever little paradox, and why it belongs in a money book rather than a psychology one. Because if the goal is respect, and the car doesn't deliver respect, then you have paid an enormous amount of money, plus the freedom from the last chapter, because that car is very likely a monthly payment for a thing that does not do the job you bought it for. That's not a small error. That's possibly the single most expensive mistake in most people's financial lives, and it's repeated monthly. And notice how it hides. Nobody says, I'm buying respect. They say, I've worked hard, I deserve it, which may well be true, or I just love cars, which is sometimes genuinely true. And if you actually love the machine for itself, this chapter isn't aimed at you at all. Housel isn't telling you to stop enjoying nice things. He's saying, check which one it is, because one of them delivers and one of them doesn't. Now, the useful flip. If what you want is to be respected and admired, and the expensive object doesn't buy it, then what does? Housel's answer is the plain one. Humility, kindness, and empathy will bring you more respect than horsepower ever will, which sounds like a fridge magnet. So let me put it the way that actually convinced me. Think of the people you genuinely admire. Not envy, admire. The ones you'd want to be like. Now ask what they drive. You almost certainly don't know. In most cases, you have never once thought about it, and if I told you, it would change nothing about how you feel about them. That's the proof. You are the evidence. Your own admiration has never once been allocated on the basis of a vehicle, and yet you keep half believing that other people's will be. So the question for this one is short, and it's uncomfortable in a quiet way. What have you bought, or what do you want to buy, mainly so that someone else would see it? Not to use, to be seen with. And if you can name it, ask the follow-up. Who, specifically, is the person you're imagining looking at it? Because in my experience, there's always a specific person, and in my experience, they are not going to look, and if they do look, they're going to imagine themselves in it. Which sets up Chapter 9 perfectly, because the man in the car has a problem you can't see from the pavement. And it's that the car is not evidence of wealth. It might be evidence of the opposite. Chapter 9. Wealth is what you don't see. So somebody drives past you in a £100,000 car, and your brain does a calculation. It happens instantly, and you don't consent to it. The calculation is, that person is rich. Now let me show you what you actually just learned about them. You learned that they have £100,000 less than they had before they bought the car. That's it. That is the entire, complete, honest inventory of what you now know about that person's finances. You don't know if they own it. You don't know if it's financed at some eye-watering rate over 7 years. You don't know if it's leased through a company that's 3 months from folding. You don't know if they inherited it. And you certainly don't know what's in their bank account, because that information is not printed on the paintwork. Housel puts it plainly. The only data point you have about their wealth is that they have less money now than they did before. And this is the distinction the chapter turns on, and it's one that the English language actively hides from us, because we use one word for two completely different things. Rich is current income. Someone with a good salary is rich. You can see rich. Rich drives past you. Wealth is income not spent. It's the car you didn't buy, the upgrade you declined, the money that is sitting there, unconverted into anything visible, which means, and this is the sentence that reorganizes everything, wealth is, by definition, invisible. It is the option you have retained, and options don't have a color or a badge. So when you look around and try to work out how you're doing, you are comparing your actual financial position to other people's spending. You're comparing your whole hand to their showreel, and you're losing that comparison every single day against people who may well be losing it too. Housel has a line that should probably be tattooed on the inside of every advert. We tend to judge wealth by what we see, because that's the information available to us. We can't see people's bank accounts. So we rely on outward appearances to gauge financial success. Cars, homes, Instagram photos. Modern capitalism, he says, makes helping people fake it until they make it a cherished industry. And here's the trap that follows, and I think it's the most practically damaging idea in the whole book. We learn to be wealthy from people who look rich. Where else would we learn it? There is no other visible curriculum. So you watch the people who appear to be winning, and you copy their behavior, and their behavior is spending, because that's the only part of their behavior that's visible. You are, quite literally, studying the wrong half of the process. Remember Ronald Reed from The Hook, the janitor with $8 million. Nobody was studying Ronald Reed. He patched his coat with safety pins. He was visually the least instructive person in Vermont. His entire method was invisible by construction. And Richard Fusconi, the Merrill Lynch executive with the 11,000 square foot house and the 2 elevators, he was extremely visible, extremely impressive, and going bankrupt. If you had looked at those 2 men in 2010 and asked which one to copy, you would have copied the wrong one, using the best evidence available to you. Housel gives another one that stops the argument dead. The singer Rihanna nearly went bankrupt after overspending and sued her financial advisor over it. And the advisor's response is the whole chapter in one sentence. Was it really necessary to tell her that if you spend money on things, you will end up with the things and not the money? You know that, I know that. And it doesn't help, because knowing it and feeling it are different, and the feeling is being manufactured against you all day long. Now, the useful part. What do you actually do with this? 2 things. The first is a correction to how you read the world. When you see someone's expensive thing, add the missing half of the sentence. Not they're rich, but they had at least that much, and now they have that much less. That's not bitterness. It's just completing an incomplete data point, and it takes about a second, and it will slowly stop you calibrating your life against a fiction. The second is about who you learn from. If wealth is invisible, then the people worth studying are unfortunately invisible too, which means you can't find them by looking. You have to find them by asking, and by noticing the people whose lives seem strangely unbothered. The ones who left the job, the ones who took a year, the ones who don't seem to need anything from anyone. That's what wealth looks like from the outside, and it looks like almost nothing at all. Now, my honest problem with this chapter, and I say it because I think the book is a bit too pleased with itself here. Wealth is what you don't see is true, and it's also extremely convenient for anyone who hasn't got much. It gives you a way to look at someone else's Ferrari and feel superior without changing anything about your own situation. Invisible wealth and no wealth look identical from the outside, including to yourself. So the test can't be, I didn't buy it. The test has to be, where did the money go instead? Because if the honest answer is that it dribbled away on nothing in particular, then you haven't practiced restraint, you've just been slower about it. Which is exactly the gap chapter 10 closes. So the question, whose finances have you been quietly comparing yourself against? Name them, there's someone. Now, what do you actually know about their money? Not what have you seen. What do you know? Because I'd guess the honest answer is that you've been losing a race, for years, against a number you invented from a car park. And that leads straight into 10, which is the shortest possible answer to, so how do I actually build the invisible kind? And it has almost nothing to do with what you earn. Chapter 10. Save money. So in the 1970s, the world had an energy crisis, and everybody agreed on what the problem was. The problem was supply. There wasn't enough oil, so the entire conversation, the politics, the research money, the panic, went into finding more of it. Drill more, discover more, extract more. And then something happened that almost nobody had been working on. Between roughly 1975 and today, the American economy got about twice as energy efficient, which means that $1 of economic output needs half the energy it used to. Better insulation, better engines, better everything. So the energy problem was solved from both ends, not just by finding more energy, by needing less of it. And here's Housel's point, which is one of those analogies that only works because it's exactly right rather than nearly right. There are two ways to get more wealth: earn more, or need less. And we treat one of them as the real answer and the other as a consolation prize. Building wealth has little to do with your income or your investment returns, and lots to do with your savings rate. Now that sounds like something a boring uncle says. So let me make it precise, because the arithmetic is stronger than the slogan. Your savings rate is the one variable in the whole equation that you actually control. You do not control your investment returns. Nobody does. You can be the greatest investor alive, and the market will still do what it does for a decade. You have limited control over your income. You can work on it, but it's negotiated with other people, and it's slow, and it's partly luck, as Chapter 2 so cheerfully explained. But the gap between your ego and your income, that's yours. That's a decision you make, and you can make it today, and nobody has to agree to it. And here's the thing that follows, and that people really don't like. Savings are wealth you can create out of nothing, at will. Because a pound saved is not the same as a pound earned. A pound earned is taxed, and then commuted to, and then paid for in hours of your life. A pound of spending you simply didn't do is worth more than a pound of income. Housel makes the point that saving is like income you don't have to pay tax on. Now here's the part I want to spend real time on, because it's where this chapter is different from every other bit of financial advice you've ever been given. Housel says something quietly radical. Past a certain level of income, what you need is just what sits below your ego. Not your needs, your ego. Because most people, past a fairly modest point, are not spending on survival. They're spending on identity, on what a person like me has, on the version of yourself you're presenting, and that means the savings rate is not really a budgeting problem at all. Budgeting apps treat it as arithmetic. It isn't. It's a question about how much of your self-image you're renting from other people. Which is why the single most powerful move here isn't earning more. It's wanting less, because wanting less is free, instant, and doesn't require anyone's permission. And Housel goes further, into the bit that made me sit up. He says people's ability to save is more in their control than they think. And you can save by wanting less, and you want less when you care less about what others think of you. Chain that together. Your savings rate is downstream of how much you need other people's approval, which means Chapter 8 and Chapter 9 and Chapter 10 are all the same chapter. The man in the car wanted respect. The respect didn't arrive. The purchase was visible and the wealth wasn't. And the reason he made the purchase at all was that he was, in Housel's framing, spending money he had for a feeling he never received. Now, what is saving actually for? Because this is where most advice goes weak. Save for a goal is the standard line. House deposit, retirement. Car. Housel says, save without a specific goal. Save for the things you cannot possibly foresee. Because a goal-linked saving is really just deferred spending. And the value of savings that aren't attached to anything is that they buy the one thing this book keeps coming back to: flexibility and control over your time. Savings with no purpose are savings that can become any purpose. They're the ability to change your mind, to take the job that pays less and means more, to wait out a bad market rather than sell into it, to not have to say yes. And there's a competitive angle here I hadn't considered before, which Housel puts well. In a world where a lot of people are highly skilled and highly educated, the hard skills are increasingly commoditized. The rare thing isn't intelligence anymore. The rare thing is flexibility, the ability to wait, to pivot, to take an opportunity that requires you to go 6 months without income. Savings buy that. Nothing else does. Now the honest limitation, and it's the same one that shadows this whole book. There is a flaw below which just save more is not advice, it's an insult. If your income doesn't cover your outgoings, the savings rate isn't a dial you're refusing to turn. There's no dial. Housel says, past a certain level of income, and that qualifier is doing an enormous amount of work that a lot of readers skip straight past. But above that floor, and it's a lower floor than most people admit, because most of us are further from it than our spending suggests, the mechanism holds completely. The gap between ego and income is real, and it's usually much wider than we'd like to say out loud. So the question, if your income went up 20% tomorrow, what would you spend it on? Have the answer. Good. Now, why aren't you saving that amount right now? Because if you can name what the extra 20% would buy, then you've just proved the thing is optional. You've been living without it perfectly well. And if it's optional at the higher income, it was optional at this one. That's the whole chapter, really. Not spend less. Just notice that the number you think you need is a number you invented, and check who you invented it for. Which is where Chapter 11 picks up, because everything I've just said is mathematically correct, and Housel is about to argue that being mathematically correct is often the wrong thing to be. Chapter 11. Reasonable is better than rational. So there's a doctor in the 1920s who cures syphilis by giving people malaria. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it's not a joke and it won the Nobel Prize. His name was Julius Wagner Jureg, and he'd noticed something in his patients. The ones who caught a serious fever from some unrelated illness sometimes recovered from things they shouldn't have recovered from. Because fever isn't just a symptom, fever is the body fighting. Raise the temperature enough, and some infections simply cannot survive it. At the time, syphilis was a death sentence, so Wagner Jureg started deliberately infecting syphilis patients with weak strains of typhoid, then smallpox, then eventually malaria. Because malaria gives you tremendous fevers, and crucially, malaria could then be cured with quinine. Patients got a few rounds of bone-shaking fever, the syphilis died, and then he treated the malaria. The results were extraordinary. Something like 6 in 10 patients treated this way recovered, compared with about 3 in 10 left alone. Nobel Prize, 1927, and today we don't do this. Obviously, it killed roughly 1 in 7 patients, and there are better options now. But here's Housel's observation about modern medicine that I found genuinely startling. We still don't really use fever as a treatment. In fact, the standard response to a fever is to suppress it. Paracetamol, ibuprofen. Bring it down, even though there's decent evidence that the fever was helping. Why? Because a fever is agony, and people don't want to be in agony. They want the paracetamol, and a doctor whose job is to make a suffering human being feel better is not going to say, actually the suffering is load-bearing, off you go. The treatment that works on a spreadsheet is not the treatment people will accept in a bed, and that is the entire chapter, transplanted onto money. Housel's claim, aim to be reasonable rather than rational. Coldly rational is a fantasy. What actually works is a plan you can stick to, and sticking to it is an emotional problem, not a mathematical one. Let me give you his example, because it's the one that lands. Take a homeowner paying off a mortgage early. Financially, on paper, in most eras, this is a mistake. Mortgage rates are low, the money would very likely earn more invested elsewhere, and the math says so clearly. Housel has paid off his own house, and he knows the maths. He describes it as one of the worst financial decisions he's made, and one of the best money decisions he's made. Because what he bought wasn't a return. He bought independence. He bought the feeling of not owing anybody anything, which means he sleeps, which means he doesn't panic, which means when the market falls 40%, he doesn't sell. The suboptimal decision protected the optimal behavior. And that's not a rounding error. Remember Chapter 4, the entire game is not being interrupted. A rational plan you abandon in a panic returns less than a merely reasonable plan you never abandon. So the irrational comfort is not a weakness in the plan. It's the fuel that lets the plan run. Now Housel takes it somewhere I really liked, which is, love what you own. He says a big part of why people stick with investments is something almost nobody in finance will admit to, that you should invest in things you actually find interesting and are proud of, because that's what gets you through the bad stretches. Which sounds soft, but think about what it competes with. The alternative is holding something you feel nothing about, purely because a formula said so, through a 5-year period where it does nothing but lose. Almost nobody can do that. The formula doesn't survive contact with a human being having a bad decade. And there's the home country bias example, which I found the most persuasive part of the chapter. Investors around the world massively overweight their own country's companies. Americans hold way more American stocks than global market weights justify. On a spreadsheet that's irrational, an obvious failure to diversify. Housel's defense is, investing is not a hard science. It's people making decisions with imperfect information about things that matter enormously to them. And being around things that feel familiar is what stops you doing something stupid at the worst moment. Familiarity is a form of risk management. It doesn't look like one on the chart. Now, let me push back a bit, because I don't think this chapter is free of danger, and I don't think Housel fully guards it. Be reasonable, not rational, is an argument that can justify almost anything. Every bad financial habit you've got can be dressed up as emotionally sustainable. The person who keeps everything in cash because markets scare them is being reasonable, not rational. So is the person who buys a boat. It's a genuinely useful principle, and it's also a beautifully shaped excuse, and the book doesn't give you a clean test for telling those apart. The best test I can construct from the chapter is this. Does the unreasonable thing you're doing make you more likely to stay the course, or does it just make you more comfortable right now? Paying off a mortgage early makes you harder to break. Keeping everything in cash for 40 years makes you feel calm while guaranteeing you lose. One is buying durability, the other is buying anesthetic. They feel identical from the inside, which is exactly why you have to ask. So the question, what's the financially wrong thing you do that you have no intention of stopping? You've got one. The savings account that's too big. The debt you overpaid. The insurance you don't strictly need. The thing your more financially literate friend raises an eyebrow at. Now ask honestly, does it let you sleep, or does it just let you avoid thinking about it? Because if it's the first one, this chapter says keep it, and the maths can lose the argument. That's a real permission, and I think a lot of people need to hear it. And if it's the second one, you already knew that before I asked. Which brings us to Chapter 12, and Chapter 12 is about the one thing that makes every plan, reasonable or rational, much less reliable than you think it is. It's about how spectacularly bad history is at predicting the future, and how confidently we use it anyway. Chapter 12. Surprise. So imagine you're a geologist and you're trying to work out how often big earthquakes happen. You dig into the record, thousands of years of data, and you use it quite properly to build a model of what's likely. That works. Geology is a hard science. The rules that governed earthquakes 10,000 years ago are the rules that govern them now. Because rock doesn't change its mind. Now imagine you're an investor. And you do exactly the same thing with market history. You look at the last 100 years. You find the average return, the average drawdown, the average recovery. And you build a plan. And Housel's argument is that you have just done something that looks identical to what the geologist did and is in fact completely different. Because your data was generated by human beings, and human beings change the rules while you're reading them. Here's how much they changed them. Housel points at how recent almost everything in modern finance is. The 401k, the main vehicle Americans retire on, is 30-something years old. The Roth IRA was created in the 1990s. The index fund is only about 50 years old. Venture capital barely existed before the 1980s. So when someone says, history shows us that retirement investing works like this, what history? The thing itself is younger than a lot of the people relying on it. And the deeper point is about the market itself. The composition of the S&P 500 in 1980 versus today is barely the same animal. Whole sectors that dominate now, software, biotech, did not meaningfully exist. Interest rates, tax law, information speed, who's allowed to invest, how quickly you can trade, all different. Housel's line, the further back in history you look, the more general your takeaways should be. You can take from history that people get greedy, that they panic, that they overreact, that bubbles inflate and pop. Those are about human nature, and human nature is the stable part. What you cannot take from history is specifics. How much stocks return, what a normal recession looks like, how long recoveries take. Those come from a world with different rules, and using them as a forecast is like navigating with a map of a country that has since had its rivers moved. Now here's the part I think is the most valuable idea in the chapter, and it's counterintuitive enough that it took me a second read. Relying on past data as a guide to the future doesn't just fail. It fails in a specific, dangerous way. It makes you blind to the outlier events that drive everything. Because the most important events in economic history are, almost by definition, the ones that had never happened before. That's what makes them important. The Great Depression, World War II, the 2008 crisis, a pandemic. If your model is built on what has happened, you have built a model that structurally excludes the category of thing that matters most. Housel gives the killer version. The most common plot of economic history is the role of surprises. And then the killer illustration. If you'd been an investor in 1930 who had studied the previous 50 years of history diligently, you would have had no framework whatsoever for what was about to happen, because nothing in your data had ever done that, which is a genuinely uncomfortable thought. The most consequential thing in your financial lifetime is likely to be something that, right now, is not in anyone's spreadsheet. Now, this could tip into fatalism, so let's be careful, because Housel isn't saying planning is pointless. He's saying something more specific. History is the study of change, ironically used as a map of the future. And the way out isn't to stop using history. It's to change what you take from it. Use it for calibration of human behavior, not for prediction of numbers. Use it to know that something will go wrong, without needing to know what. Which loops directly back to the survival argument. If you cannot forecast the specific disaster, the only defense is a structure that survives an unspecified one. That's not pessimism. It's the recognition that the useful preparation is generic, because the threat is unknown. Now, the trap that Housel names and that I see constantly. People who study history a lot often become more confident, not less. They've read about the crashes, so they feel prepared for the crash, and what they're actually prepared for is a rerun of a specific crash they've studied, which is precisely the thing that won't happen, because the market has already priced in everything everyone learned from that one. The expert who has memorized 2008 is well defended against 2008, and no better defended than you against whatever's next. And there's a subtler version that applies to your own life, not just markets. Your personal history has the same problem. Chapter 1 told us your worldview is built from a tiny sample of experience. This chapter adds the sting. That sample is not just small, it's out of date. The conditions that generated your beliefs about work or property or job security or what a safe career is, those conditions have moved, and your instincts haven't been notified, which is why the person who lived through one property crash is overcautious for 30 years, and the person who lived through one boom is overconfident for 30 years, and neither is really responding to the world that currently exists. So, the practical residue, because I don't want to leave this as a shrug. 3 things I take from it. 1. Be suspicious of any plan whose success depends on the future resembling a particular stretch of the past, especially a stretch you personally lived through. 2. Prepare generically rather than specifically. Room for error, which is literally the next chapter, is the answer to a question you cannot ask in advance. 3. Take from history the behavior, not the numbers. That people panic is permanent. When and why they'll panic next is not knowable, and pretending otherwise is how you get caught. And the question for this one, what are you assuming about the next 10 years that is really just a description of the last 10? About your industry, about property, about what's safe and what's risky, about whether your skills will still be worth something. Because whatever answer comes up first, that's the belief you built out of a sample you happen to live through, and it is the one you will defend hardest, and it is the one most likely to be quietly out of date. Which is exactly why Chapter 13 exists, and why it might be the most immediately useful chapter in the whole book. If you cannot know what's coming, the only sane response is to build in room to be wrong. Chapter 13. Room for Error. So the best financial lesson in this chapter comes from people cheating at cards. Not cheating exactly, card counting. And the mechanics are simple enough. You track roughly what's left in the deck, and when the remaining cards happen to favor you, you bet bigger. When they don't, you bet smaller or you sit out. Here's the part that matters, and it isn't the arithmetic. A card counter never knows what the next card is. Never. What they know is that the odds have tilted a little in their favor. That's all. They are placing bets on probabilities in a game where any individual hand can go horribly wrong. So Kevin Lewis, one of the successful counters from the MIT team, makes the observation that card counting is statistically proven to work, and it does not guarantee you win every hand. Not even close. It guarantees over enough hands that you come out ahead provided you're still at the table, which means the entire skill isn't the counting. Any competent person can learn the counting. The skill is sizing your bets so that a run of bad hands can't remove you from the game, and that's the chapter. Housel's word for it, borrowed from Benjamin Graham, is margin of safety, room for error. And he says it's one of the most underappreciated forces in finance because it looks like conservatism, and conservatism is boring, and it has a terrible reputation among people who want to look clever. But margin of safety isn't conservatism. Housel is quite precise about this. Conservatism is avoiding a certain level of risk. Margin of safety is raising the odds of success at a given level of risk by increasing your endurance. You're not taking less risk, you're making yourself harder to kill while taking it, which is the difference between driving slowly and wearing a seatbelt. Now let me tell you why we don't do this, because we know it and we still don't do it. Because room for error looks like waste when things are going well. The cash sitting there earning nothing, the extra buffer, the insurance that never paid out, the debt you could have taken and didn't. Every single one of those on a good day is a visible drag on your returns, and someone in your life will point that out. And they're right on a good day. They're right for years, and then they're catastrophically wrong once, and once is all it takes. Housel gives the framing I now use constantly. What's the largest decline you can survive? Not tolerate on a risk questionnaire, survive in the sense that you don't have to sell, don't have to borrow, don't have to change your life. He points out that people usually answer this question about their spreadsheet. Can I still pay the bills if my portfolio drops 30%? And forget entirely to ask it about their head. It's easy to underestimate what a 30% decline does to your psychology. Your confidence gets destroyed at precisely the moment the opportunity is greatest. That's not a hypothetical. That's the standard human experience of a crash. So the buffer isn't only financial. Part of what you're buying is the ability to keep believing your own plan while it's losing. Now, the single most important paragraph in this chapter, for my money. Housel says the biggest single point of failure with money is a sole reliance on a paycheck to fund short-term spending needs, with no savings to create a gap between what you think your expenses are and what they might be in the future. Read that slowly, not you should save. The failure mode is a single point of failure. One income, no gap, everything calibrated to a world where nothing changes. And there's a related trap he names. You can't just plan for the risks you can foresee, because the ones that get you are the ones you can't, which is Chapter 12, handing the baton over. The whole reason you need generic room is that specific prediction doesn't work. He also has a rule about the risks that are genuinely different in kind. Never risk what you have and need for what you don't have and don't need. That's the Russian roulette version. There are odds that are statistically excellent and still insane to take because the downside isn't a loss, it's removal from the game. You cannot recover from ruin by being right afterwards. Some risks aren't a bad bet. They're a bet you can only lose once. Now, how does a normal person actually apply this? I'd say 4 places. Income. One source is a single point of failure. Not everyone can build a second, but noticing that you have one is different from pretending you don't. Spending. The gap between what your expenses are and what they could be. Not a budget, a gap. Time. Not needing the money at a specific date is itself a margin. Every deadline you attach to money is a reduction in your room for error because it removes your ability to wait. Your own head. Assume you will behave worse under stress than you currently imagine. Everyone thinks they'll be the calm one. The evidence on this is not kind. Now the honest tension in this chapter, and Housel would agree with me here, I think. Room for error has a cost, and the cost is real, and it's not just returns. A very large buffer held for 40 years is a genuine amount of life you could have spent. There's a version of this that curdles into never doing anything, waiting forever, dying with a large cash pile and a small life. The chapter is right that most people carry too little margin. But more margin is always better, isn't the lesson. The lesson is that margin is what buys you endurance, and endurance only matters if you're actually playing. So, the question, and it's the one I genuinely ask you to answer out loud. What is your single point of failure? Not what's your biggest risk in general. What is the one thing that, if it stopped tomorrow, would force you to start undoing everything you've built? For most people, it's one income. For some, it's one client, one relationship, one landlord, one visa, one skill that's about to be automated. You know what yours is. You've known for a while, and the useful part is that you don't have to fix it today. You just have to stop building on top of it as though it's solid. Which leads into 14, and 14 is the one that got me, because it turns out the biggest threat to any long-term plan isn't the market at all. It's that the person who made the plan is going to stop existing and get replaced by someone who wants different things. Chapter 14. You'll change. So think about who you were at 18 and what you wanted your life to look like. Now think about whether that person would recognize the deal you've made. Some of you are going to find that funny, and some of you are going to find it a bit painful, and both reactions are the chapter. Housel builds this one on research by the Harvard psychologist Daniel Gilbert, and the finding is one of the most reliably weird things in psychology. Gilbert's team asked people 2 questions. How much have you changed in the last 10 years, and how much do you expect to change in the next 10? People are perfectly happy to describe enormous change behind them. Different values, different tastes, different priorities, different friends. Yes, obviously I've changed a lot. And then they predict that they'll change very little going forward. Gilbert's phrase for it is beautiful. Human beings are works in progress that mistakenly think they're finished. Every single one of us is standing at what feels like the end of our development. Whoever you are right now feels like the final draft, and you have felt exactly that way at every previous age, about a person you now consider naive. Gilbert calls it the end of history illusion. And it doesn't wear off with age or education. 60-year-olds do it too. Now, why does this belong in a money book? Because long-term financial planning is, structurally, a promise made on behalf of a stranger. You're deciding at 30 what a 55-year-old should do with his time. And you don't know him. You've never met him. You're guessing his preferences based on yours, and the one thing the research says confidently is that his will be different. So the plan gets made by someone who won't be there to live it. And then two things go wrong, and Housel names both. The first is that we make extreme long-term plans. The person who decides at 22 that they'll work 100 hours a week for 20 years to retire at 42. The person who says they'll live on nothing forever. The person who commits to a career path they picked before they'd had any adult experience of what work feels like. Housel's advice here is unusually concrete. Avoid the extreme ends of financial planning, not because extremes don't work, but because the downside of an extreme plan is that you'll probably abandon it, and abandoning it wastes everything you put in. Assuming you'll be happy with a very low income, or that you'll endlessly sacrifice every pleasure for a high savings rate, raises the odds that you'll wake up one day and regret it, and then reverse. And the reversal is expensive because compounding hates being interrupted, and because you also spent the years. The moderate plan you keep beats the perfect plan you quit, which is chapter 11 again, wearing a different hat. The second failure is worse, and it's the one I think most people are actually living inside. Sunk costs. Because when you do change, and you will, the old plan doesn't just quietly retire. It sits there and says, "Look how much you've put into me. The degree you don't want to use. The career you built and no longer want. The business, the city, the relationship, the identity. Every year you spent on it becomes an argument for spending another one." Housel has a story about this that stuck with me. He mentions a colleague of Daniel Kahneman's noticing how Kahneman handled being shown he was wrong about something he'd worked on for a long time. No defensiveness, no grief. He just moved. And when asked about it, Kahneman said, "I have no sunk costs. Sunk costs, anchoring decisions to past effort that can't be refunded, are, as Housel puts it, a devil in a world where people change over time. They make our future selves prisoners of our past, different selves." That's the sentence. Your future self is being held hostage by a person who no longer exists, on the grounds that he already paid. Now, and I want to be honest here, because this is where I think the chapter is easy to misread. This is not permission to abandon everything the moment it gets hard. That's the cheap version, and it would destroy the entire argument of chapter 4, which is that not being interrupted is where all the money comes from. The distinction, I think, is between changing because the work is hard and changing because you are no longer the person the plan was for. The first one is the thing compounding punishes. The second one is just being alive. And the test is uncomfortable but simple. If the plan were suddenly finished tomorrow, no more effort required, you just have the outcome. Would you want it? If yes, keep going. It's just hard. If no, then you have been paying installments on something you no longer want, and every additional payment is an argument for the next one. So what's the actual practical move? Housel says, aim for moderation at every point in your plan. A reasonable annual savings rate, a reasonable commute, a reasonable amount of time with your family. Things that are sustainable rather than heroic. Because sustainable is what survives the person you become, and accept that changing your mind is a normal cost of a long life, not a failure of character. So, the question, and I think this is the most personally loaded one in the book. What are you still doing, mainly because of how much you've already put into it? Take a second on it. It's rarely the money. It's usually a career, or a skill, or a version of yourself you announce to people. And then the follow-up, which is the one that actually decides it. If you were starting from today, with what you know now and nothing already invested, would you choose it? Because the 18-year-old who chose it for you had less information than you do, and he isn't the one who has to live in it. Which is a good place to arrive at chapter 15, because everything I've just described, the changing, the moderation, the room for error, the surviving, has a price attached to it. And this book's argument is that almost everybody who fails with money fails because they tried not to pay it. Chapter 15. Nothing's free. So imagine you're in a car showroom and there's a car you want and it costs £30,000. You have three options. You pay the $30,000, or you find a cheaper car, or you steal it. Everybody understands this. Nobody walks into a showroom confused about the arrangement. The price is on the windscreen and you either pay it or you don't get the car. Now here's Housel's observation, and it's one of those things that's obvious the moment someone says it and invisible until they do. Everything worth having has a price, and most of the important prices aren't on a windscreen. You can see the price of a car. You cannot see the price of a good marriage, or a career you're proud of, or a healthy body. And you certainly can't see the price of investment returns, which is what this chapter is about. So watch what happens when the price is hidden. Housel's example is the market itself. Between 1950 and 2019, the Dow went from about 200 points to around 27,000. Enormous. Life-changing. And the price of that ride was that you had to hold it through a huge number of periods where it was falling. Badly, for a long time, while every instinct in your body screamed at you to get out. That's the fee. Housel calls it exactly that. The cost of admission. And the crucial thing is that the currency isn't pounds. The currency is volatility, fear, doubt, uncertainty, and regret. And because it isn't billed to you as money, almost nobody recognizes it as a price. They experience it as a fine, as a punishment, as evidence that something has gone wrong and they should do something about it. That's the whole distinction the chapter turns on, and I think it's genuinely the most useful reframe in the book. Is this a fee or is it a fine? A fine means you did something wrong and you should change your behavior. A fee means this is the admission price and you should pay it and go in. Market declines look exactly like fines. They are almost always fees. And Housel is clear about why this matters. If you treat the fee as a fine, you do the rational-seeming thing. You avoid it. You get out. You wait for clarity. You look for a way to get the returns without the discomfort. And there is no such way. The people who try to dodge the fee usually end up paying more because they miss the recovery. Or they hop to a different strategy that has its own fee. Or they simply never get the thing at all. Now let me give you the flip side, because Housel does something clever here that stops this becoming just endure everything. He tells the story of GE, and it's a brutal little case study. GE was, at one point, the most valuable company in the world. The 2008 crisis wrecked its financing division. The stock fell from around $40 in 2007 to $7 in 2018. And Jeff Immelt, the CEO, took the blame. But Housel's point isn't about Immelt's competence. It's about a specific thing his successor said. GE had been doing what he called success theater. The company had spent years producing the appearance of steady results, hitting earnings targets quarter after quarter, because that's what the market rewarded. They had refused to pay the price of honest volatility, so they paid a much larger one later. That's the same lesson in corporate form. The fee doesn't go away when you refuse it. It just accrues interest and arrives all at once. Now, how do you actually use this? Housel's answer is to define the price in advance and decide you'll pay it, which sounds soft until you notice how differently you behave when you've done it. Think about a theme park. You pay £100 to get in, and then you queue for 40 minutes for every ride. The queue is miserable. But you don't stand in the queue thinking, something has gone wrong, I should leave. You knew about the queue. The queue was the deal. Now think about the last time your investments, or your business, or your career had a bad 6 months. Did that feel like the queue? Or did it feel like a mistake? Almost everybody experiences it as a mistake, because nobody told them the queue was part of the ticket. And there's a broader version of this that goes beyond money, which is where the chapter gets its weight. Everything you want has a hidden price. A good relationship costs you the freedom to do exactly what you want when you want it. A career you're proud of costs you years of being bad at it in public. Being fit costs discomfort forever, not once. Raising children costs, well, ask anyone. The failure mode is universal, and it's always the same shape, wanting the thing while regarding its price as an injustice. Now, my honest caveat. Everything has a price, pay it, can become a way to justify enduring things that are genuinely bad for you. Not every period of suffering is a fee. Sometimes the thing really is broken. Sometimes the job really is destroying you. Sometimes the investment really was stupid. Housel doesn't give a clean test, so here's mine, and it comes straight out of chapter 13. A fee is a cost you can survive, and that buys you something you still want. A fine is a cost that damages your ability to keep playing. If it's grinding you down but you're intact and you still want the outcome, that's a cue. If it's taking pieces off you that you can't get back, that's not a fee, that's just damage. And endurance isn't a virtue there. So, the question, what are you currently treating as a fine that's actually a fee? The boring years, the stretch where nothing's growing, the discomfort of being visibly bad at something new, the market that's down, the part of the work nobody sees, and the second half of the question, which is where it bites. Are you trying to find a version of the thing you want that doesn't have that cost? Because that version is what everyone is selling, and it doesn't exist. And looking for it is how people spend a decade paying admission at the door of a park they never actually enter. Which brings us to chapter 16, because a huge amount of the terrible financial advice you receive isn't wrong exactly. It's priced for a completely different game than the one you're playing. Chapter 16, You and Me. So it's $19.99 and there's a stock trading at a price that, by any sane measure of what the company could ever earn, is madness. And you're standing there thinking, who on earth is buying this? Here's Housel's answer, and it dissolved something I'd believed for years. The person buying it is not an idiot. The person buying it is playing a different game than you are. Because you're thinking about what this company will be worth in 20 years. And the person buying is thinking about what it'll be worth on Thursday afternoon. And on Thursday afternoon, in a rising momentum market, a stupid price can absolutely go to a stupider price. And that's not a fantasy, that's just what momentum does. For your game, the price is insane. For their game, the price is fine. They're both looking at the same number, and it means completely different things, because the time horizon is doing all the work. Housel's central claim in this chapter, few things matter more with money than understanding your own time horizon and not being persuaded by the actions of people playing different games. And this is not an abstract danger. This is, I'd argue, the single most common way ordinary people get hurt financially, and it happens through a channel nobody warns you about. It happens through advice. Because you don't take advice from an enemy. You take it from a magazine, a video, a colleague, a very confident man on the internet, and nothing about that advice is labeled with the time horizon it was written for. A day trader tells you a stock is a screaming buy. He's right, for a 2-day hold. You buy it and hold for 2 years, and you get destroyed, and you conclude you're bad at investing. You weren't bad at investing. You took a 5-day answer and used it for a 5-year question. Housel's line for the mechanism is that bubbles form when the momentum of short-term returns attracts enough money that the makeup of investors shifts from mostly long-term to mostly short-term. And it isn't irrational at that point. It's that a completely different set of players with different clocks are now setting the price. And the long-term investor, looking at the price, thinks the world has gone mad, when actually the world has just changed its shift. Now let me put the honest version of this, because Housel is unusually careful here, and I want to keep it. He does not say bubbles are just misunderstandings and nobody's at fault. Bubbles ruin lives. The dot-com implosion destroyed $6.2 trillion of household wealth. The housing bubble, more than $8 trillion. That's not a philosophical curiosity, that's people's houses and retirements. His point is narrower. Blaming it on greed and stupidity gets you nothing you can use because you cannot protect yourself against a personality trait. Whereas you can protect yourself against a mismatch of time horizons. Because that's a thing you can check. So how do you actually check it? 2 moves, and they're both about labeling. First, know your own game. Actually name it. Are you saving for something in 3 years or 30? Is this money you'll need or money you're leaving alone? Because until you've said that out loud, you have no filter, and every piece of advice sounds equally applicable. Second, before you take anything on board, ask what game the person saying it is playing. Not whether they're honest. Most of them are perfectly honest. Whether their clock matches yours. The financial commentator who has to say something new every single day is not lying to you. He is doing a job that requires daily novelty. His time horizon is the broadcast. Yours is your life. Those 2 things have almost nothing in common, and the mismatch is invisible because the words are the same. And I want to widen this out because I think the idea is much bigger than investing. Almost every piece of career advice you've received came from someone playing a different game. The person who says, just take the risk, go freelance, may have had a partner with a salary or a safety net or no dependents or a different decade. The person who says, stay, be loyal, get the pension, is describing a labor market that may not exist anymore. None of them are lying. All of them are describing a route that worked from a starting point that wasn't yours. Housel's version applies cleanly. Be wary of taking cues from people playing a different game than you are. And there's an uncomfortable inversion, which is that you are one of those people to somebody else. When you tell a friend what they should do with their money, you're describing your game with your clock and your risk tolerance and your luck from Chapter 2. Now the thing I think Housel underplays. Knowing your time horizon sounds easy and isn't, because Chapter 14 already told us you're going to change. The 30-year horizon you're so confident about is being set by a person who will be replaced. So know your game isn't a one-off act. It's a thing you have to recheck because the game changes under you when your life does. Which is, I think, why room for error keeps reappearing. It's the thing that protects you when you discover midway that you were playing a different game than you thought. So, the question, whose financial advice are you currently following? Name them. It might be a person, or it might be a general vibe you absorbed from somewhere. Now, what's their time horizon? What are they actually optimizing for? What happens to them if the advice is wrong for you? Because for a great many of the voices telling you what to do with money, the answer to that last one is nothing at all. And that includes this video, which brings me to a point I should probably make explicitly, given we're 3 hours into a book about money. I'm not a financial advisor, I don't know your situation, and my time horizon is not yours. This whole channel is a book being retold, not a plan being sold. Take the ideas and check them against your own clock, which sets up 17, and 17 is my favorite chapter in the book, because it explains why the advice that gets the most attention is almost always the advice that sounds the most like doom. Chapter 17. The Seduction of Pessimism. The historian Deirdre McCloskey has a line that opens this chapter, and it's the whole thing in one sentence. For reasons I have never understood, people like to hear that the world is going to hell. So let me tell you about a Russian professor called Igor Panarin. In the late 2000s, Panarin predicted that the United States would collapse, not decline, collapse. He gave a date, around mid-2010, and he'd worked out how the pieces would fall. America would fracture into 6 parts, with different regions falling under the influence of different foreign powers. He had a map. He named the resulting countries. One of them was the Central North American Republic. This got serious coverage, Wall Street Journal, prime-time interviews. A man with a map of the dismembered United States treated as a plausible view. Now, imagine the opposite forecast. Imagine someone in 2008 saying, actually, over the next decade, American markets will roughly quadruple and the country will be entirely intact. That person would have been laughed out of the room. That prediction would have sounded not just wrong, but unserious. Naive, the sort of thing said by someone who doesn't understand how bad things are. And it would have been correct. That's the asymmetry, and it's the chapter. Pessimism sounds like intelligence, and optimism sounds like a sales pitch. Housel's point is that optimism is generally the better bet, and simultaneously the harder thing to say out loud without sounding like an idiot. So why does the human brain do this? He gives several reasons, and they're all good, but 3 of them do the real work. 1, money is everywhere, so bad news touches everyone. A problem in one industry is interesting to that industry. A problem with money is a problem for you, your parents, your job and your future all at once. So it commands attention in a way almost nothing else does. 2, losses hurt more than gains feel good. This is Kahneman's territory. Housel calls the asymmetric aversion to loss an evolutionary shield. And it is. The creature that responded equally to threat and opportunity got eaten. You are descended from the ones who flinched, which means your emotional weighting of bad financial news is not a bias to be corrected so much as a piece of standard equipment you have to work around. 3. And this is the one I think is the most beautiful idea in the book. Progress happens too slowly to notice, but setbacks happen too quickly to ignore. Sit with that. There are so many overnight tragedies and almost no overnight miracles. A plane crash takes seconds. Aviation safety took 70 years of 1,000 invisible improvements. A market crash takes a fortnight. A market recovery takes 5 years and never has a headline. So the tragedies get told as stories, with a date, a cause, a villain. And the progress gets told as statistics, which is to say, not told at all. Housel gives the example of aviation and of medicine. The number of lives saved by incremental improvement in heart disease treatment over decades is astronomically larger than the death toll of any single disaster you can name. And you cannot name a single day on which that progress happened because there wasn't one. You are not pessimistic because you're a pessimist. You're pessimistic because your information diet is structurally biased. Disasters are events and progress is a rate. Now let me be careful here, because there's a cheap version of this chapter that I don't want to hand you. The cheap version is, cheer up, things are fine. Housel is not saying that, and it would be a bad reading. He's saying something more precise, that the correct stance is optimism about the long run, combined with a clear-eyed acceptance of short-term disaster, which is the barbelled personality from Chapter 5. The pessimism is right about the next 2 years. The optimism is right about the next 30. Most people mix these up and apply the wrong one to the wrong horizon. And this has a very concrete financial consequence. If you are seduced by pessimism, you will do 2 things. You'll sit out of things that compound because entering feels reckless, and you'll bail during the setbacks because the setback confirms what you already believed. Both of those are the interruption. Chapter 4 told us the interruption is where all the money goes. So the pessimism doesn't just make you sad, it's expensive, and the bill arrives 30 years later in the form of a much smaller number. Now my honest reservation, and this chapter genuinely needs one. Optimism is the better bet is true in aggregate and across long periods and for diversified things. It is not automatically true for your particular company, your particular industry, your particular country, or your particular decade. Plenty of individual optimists were correctly ruined. Japan's stock market took roughly 30 years to recover its 1989 peak. If your horizon was a career, it recovers eventually was not much comfort. So the honest form of this chapter isn't be optimistic. It's be optimistic about the broadest possible thing over the longest possible period, and be paranoid about anything narrower or shorter than that, which is exactly why room for error exists. It's what lets a rational optimist survive being locally wrong. And there's one more thing here that goes past money entirely. Notice how you feel about a person who says things are getting better. There's a slight suspicion, isn't there? A sense that they haven't quite looked hard enough. Whereas a person who says everything is broken sounds like they've seen something. That reflex is not analysis, it's a costume. Doom is the cheapest available way to sound serious, and it's been the cheapest way for as long as anybody has been writing things down. So, the question: what's the most pessimistic thing you currently believe about your money, your career, or your future? Got it? Right. Now, where did it come from? Was it a thing you worked out from evidence? Or was it a thing you absorbed because it sounded like the grown-up position? And here's the follow-up that actually costs something to answer. What would you be doing differently right now if you didn't believe it? Because if the honest answer is, I'd have started something, then that belief has a price, and you've been paying it quietly for years. Which is the perfect way into Chapter 18, because the reason we believe both the doom and the fairy tales comes down to the same mechanism, and Housel's version of it is the most uncomfortable idea in the entire book. Chapter 18. When you'll believe anything. So there's a man in Yemen called Ali Hajaji, and his son is sick. The elders of his village recommend a folk remedy. You take the tip of a burning stick and you press it to the child's chest, and this is believed to drive out the illness. Housel quotes him directly, and the line is one of the saddest in the book. Hajaji says, when you have no money and your son is sick, you'll believe anything. Now I want to be extremely careful with this story, because it would be very easy to tell it as a story about somebody else's ignorance. That's not what it's doing here, and if you read it that way, you'll miss the whole chapter. Because the mechanism that got Ali Hajaji is exactly the mechanism that got the people who bought houses in 2006 and the people who gave their savings to Bernie Madoff. And it will be the mechanism that gets you. Here's how Housel builds it. He says, the more you want something to be true, the more likely you are to believe a story that overestimates the odds of it being true. And then he gives it a name that I've found genuinely useful: appealing fictions. An appealing fiction happens when you are smart, you want to believe something, and you're dealing with a subject where the evidence is incomplete enough that belief can fill the gap. Notice the ingredients. It requires you to be smart. It's not a stupidity failure. Stupid people believe things for stupid reasons. Smart people construct sophisticated reasons to believe what they were already going to believe. And the more capable you are, the better your reasons will be. Now watch it operate on a national scale. In 2007 we, collectively, told a story about the stability of housing prices. That they don't fall nationally, that property is safe, that the worst case is a slowdown. Very smart people at very serious institutions believed this and priced it. In 2009, we stopped believing that story. Nothing about houses changed. The bricks were the same. What changed was the story we were willing to accept, and trillions of dollars of value moved because of it. And Madoff. Housel's point is the one people always miss. In hindsight, the scheme should have been obvious. The returns were too smooth. The auditor was a tiny two-person firm. The strategy didn't scale the way he claimed. Professionals looked at it. Some of them raised flags for years. It kept going because it was a very good story, and people wanted to believe it. Wanting to believe is not a small force. It is strong enough to overpower arithmetic in people whose entire profession is arithmetic. Now here's where it comes for you, and this is the part that made me put the book down and think about my own life, rather than about markets. Housel makes the point that everyone has an incomplete view of the world, and we fill the gaps with narratives that make sense to us. Not with, I don't know. Almost never with, I don't know. And the size of the gap is not something you can perceive from the inside, because the gap is made of things you haven't thought of. You cannot audit your blind spot with the instrument that has the blind spot, which links straight back to Chapter 1. Your worldview is built from a rounding error of experience, and this chapter adds, and then you fill in the rest with a story you find attractive, and you cannot tell which parts are which. There's an idea he raises that I keep coming back to. He talks about how much of our behavior is driven by what we want to be true, rather than what is, and how, in a field like investing, where the future is genuinely unknowable, the space for wishful thinking is enormous, because nobody can immediately prove you wrong. That's why finance attracts confident storytellers. It's not that the industry is unusually dishonest. It's that it's an industry where the evidence arrives years after the claim, and by then everyone has moved on. And the desperation multiplier is the cruelest part. Ali Hajaji's line isn't, people are gullible, it's when you have no money and your son is sick. The people most likely to be taken by an appealing fiction are the people who most need it to be true, which means financial fraud, get-rich schemes, and miracle cures are not distributed randomly. They concentrate exactly where the need is greatest. That's a moral fact about money that most money books skip. Now, what do you actually do about a bias you can't see? Housel gives two things, and I'd add a third. 1. Room for error. Again, it keeps coming back because it's the only defense that doesn't require you to be right. The gap between what you think will happen and what needs to happen for you to be okay, that gap is what protects you from your own appealing fiction. You don't have to know which of your beliefs is wrong. You just have to survive the one that is. 2. Avoid the single point of failure, especially where a story is holding it up. If your entire plan rests on one belief about the future, this industry keeps growing, this company is safe, this asset can't fall, then that belief is load-bearing, and it was built with a gap in it. 3. Notice the emotional charge. The beliefs you should be most suspicious of are the ones where being wrong would hurt. Not financially, but personally. The ones where you'd have to admit something about your last 10 years. Those are the ones you'll defend hardest and examine least. Because that's what "you'll believe anything" actually means. Not that you're credulous in general. That your skepticism switches off in precise proportion to how much you need the thing to be true. So, the question, and it's the hardest one in this whole video, what do you currently believe about your money or your work that you have never seriously tested because you don't want to know? Everyone has one. The pension you assume will be enough. The skill you assume will still be valuable. The business that you're sure will come good. The property you're certain can't fall. You know which one it is, because there's a small flinch when you look at it. And I'm not going to tell you to go and test it. Genuinely, I'm not. That's your call, and you know things about your life that I don't. But I'd note that Ali Hajaji wasn't a fool. He was a father with no money and a sick child. doing the only thing available to him, and the story he was told fitted the hole in his life exactly. Which is a good place to stop, because chapter 19 is where Housel gathers all of this into a single list, and it's the closest this book comes to actually telling you what to do. Chapter 19. All Together Now. So a man called Clarence Hughes goes to the dentist in 1931 because his mouth hurts. The dentist puts him under. When Clarence wakes up hours later, he has 16 fewer teeth and his tonsils have been removed. A week later, he's dead of complications. His wife sued, and here's the important detail. She didn't sue because the surgery went wrong. Every surgery risked death in 1931. Everyone understood that. She sued because Clarence never consented. Nobody asked him, and she said he wouldn't have agreed if they had. The case went nowhere, because in 1931, consent between doctor and patient wasn't really a concept. The prevailing ethos was that the doctor's job was to fix the patient, and what the patient thought about it was not relevant information. One court summed it up. Doctors need freedom to make the best medical decisions. Without it, we could not enjoy the advancement of science. The doctor knows, the patient receives. And that stood for a long time until a slow revolution in medical ethics replaced it with something we now think is obvious. That it's your body. That you get to know what's being proposed, and that you get to say no even when the expert disagrees. Now, why does Housel open his summary chapter with this? Because he's about to give you a list of lessons, and he wants to be honest about what a list of lessons actually is. Personal finance is deeply, irreducibly personal. There is no objectively correct answer, only the answer that works for you, your family, your history, your fears, your one life. And anyone handing you a set of rules is, structurally, in the position of that 1931 dentist, unless they say out loud, "These are options. You're the one who decides, and I don't have to live with the result. So here's the collection, and I'll give it to you as Housel does, not as commands, but as the things that seem to hold. Go out of your way to find humility when things are going right, and forgiveness when they go wrong. Because it is never as good or as bad as it looks." Chapter 2, in one line, less ego, more wealth. Saving money is the gap between your ego and your income. Wealth is what you don't see. You build it by not converting your money into evidence. Manage your money in a way that helps you sleep at night, not in a way that maximizes returns on a spreadsheet, and not in a way that impresses anyone. Sleep is the actual metric, because sleep is what keeps you from selling at the bottom. If you want to do better as an investor, the single most powerful thing you can do is increase your time horizon. Not skill, not information. Time. Buffett's 84 billion, 96% of it after 50. Become okay with a lot of things going wrong. You can be wrong half the time and still make a fortune, because the tails do the work. Disney's 400 forgotten cartoons. Use money to gain control over your time. The highest dividend it pays. Campbell's research, control beats income, health, and every other objective condition. Be nicer and less flashy. Nobody is impressed with your possessions as much as you are. The man in the car is invisible, only the car is seen. Save, just save. You don't need a specific reason. Saving for a goal is fine, but saving without one buys you flexibility. And flexibility is the rarest thing in a world of very skilled people. Define the cost of success and be ready to pay it. Volatility and fear and doubt are fees, not fines. Nothing worth having is free, and the version without the fee doesn't exist. Worship room for error, the gap between what could happen and what you need to happen in order to be okay. Avoid the extreme ends of financial decisions, because you'll change and extreme plans get abandoned, and abandonment wastes everything you put in. You should like risk, because it pays off over time. But be paranoid of ruinous risk, because it prevents you from taking future risks that pay off. Define the game you're playing and make sure your actions aren't being influenced by people playing a different one. Respect the mess. There's no single right answer. Smart, informed, reasonable people disagree in finance because they have wildly different goals and time horizons. Now, I want to say something about how to receive a list like that, because I think this is where most people get these books wrong. A list of 15 principles is not a plan. It's a set of lenses. If you try to implement all of them at once, you'll implement none of them. And if you copy someone else's ordering, you're back in the 1931 dentist's chair. And notice what's not in the list. There's no asset allocation, no number, no product, no put X% in Y. That's not an omission. Housel is quite deliberate, and the next chapter is where he finally tells you what he personally does. Precisely so you can see how ordinary and how unlike a recommendation it is. So, the question for this chapter: of everything in that list, which one made you slightly uncomfortable? Not which one is best. Which one did you skip past a bit quickly? Because that's the one aimed at you. The rest are for other people, and that's how a summary chapter should be used. Not as a checklist to nod along to, but as a list of places to check your own flinch. Which brings us to 20, and 20 is the chapter I have the most respect for in this entire book. Because Housel does the thing that almost nobody who writes about money is willing to do. He tells you exactly what he does with his own. Chapter 20. Confessions. So there's a billionaire investor called Sandy Gottesman, and when he interviews people to join his investment team, he asks one question. Not what's your best idea, not what do you think of the market. He asks, what do you own and why? Not what you recommend, not what you'd advise a client. What is actually in your account, with your money, where being wrong costs you. Housel points out how enormous the gap between those two things usually is. There's a study he mentions on this. A very large share of mutual fund managers put none of their own money in the funds they run. None. They'll sell you the thing and not eat it. So chapter 20 is Housel putting his own plate on the table. And I have more respect for this chapter than for anything else in the book, because it's the part that almost nobody writes. Here's what he says he does. He and his wife paid off their house, in cash, in their 30s. And he says plainly, it was financially the worst decision they ever made. Mortgage rates were at generational lows. The money would almost certainly have earned more elsewhere, and any spreadsheet would call it an error. And it's the best money decision they ever made, because it bought a feeling that no spreadsheet has a column for: total independence. Nobody has a claim on their house. Whatever happens to markets or jobs, that part is settled. That's chapter 11, lived rather than argued. Reasonable beat rational, on purpose, with full knowledge of the cost. Second, they keep an unusually high percentage of their assets in cash. Around 20% of assets outside the value of the house. He says any financial advisor would call that far too much. And his reason is the sentence that anchors the whole chapter. Cash is the oxygen of independence. More than that, he says the real reason for the cash is to never be forced to sell the stocks they own. Because being forced to sell is how a bad year becomes a permanent loss. The cash isn't there for returns. It's there so the rest of the plan never has to be interrupted. Which is chapter 4 and chapter 5 and chapter 13, all doing their jobs at once. The cash is the room for error that protects the compounding. Third, and this is the part people find almost disappointing, The investing itself is dull. Every stock they own is in a low-cost index fund. They put money in from every paycheck. That's the strategy. Housel notes that dollar-cost averaging into a low-cost index fund gives you the highest odds of long-term success for most investors. And that consistency over decades is where the result comes from, not cleverness. No stock picks, no timing, no system. The man who wrote the most quoted money book of the last decade invests like someone who has decided not to have opinions. And there's a fourth thing he confesses that I think is the most honest of all. He says their goal isn't to maximize returns. Their goal is to not screw up in a way that makes them have to change the plan. Because a plan that survives is worth more than a plan that's optimal. Now, why does this chapter matter so much? Because it's the antidote to everything the financial industry does to you. The industry's product is interestingness. It has to be, because you cannot charge a fee for put money in a boring fund every month and don't look at it for 30 years. So the entire apparatus, the channels, the newsletters, the guys with the charts, exists to make the process feel complicated enough to justify their presence in it. And here's a man with every reason to look sophisticated, saying, I pay off my mortgage, I keep too much cash, I buy index funds, and I try not to break the thing. Notice, too, that his choices contradict the maths on purpose, and he tells you they do. He isn't claiming his way is optimal. He's demonstrating Chapter 11, that a suboptimal plan you can hold is worth more than an optimal plan you'll abandon, using himself as the evidence. Now, my honest note, and it's the one that leads into the honest chapter. There's a version of this that's easy to read as universal and isn't. Paying off a house in your 30s requires having a house and having the money. Keeping 20% of your assets in cash requires having assets. Independence as a goal is a much more available goal when the floor beneath you is solid. Housel would, I think, agree. He's careful to say these are his choices for his life and not a recommendation. But it's worth naming, because the honest gap between here's what works for me and here's what will work for you is exactly the gap Chapter 19 opened with the dentist. What travels regardless of income, though, is the shape of it. Choose independence over optimization, keep more buffer than looks smart. Make the thing boring on purpose, and be able to answer Gottesman's question. So, the question, and it's his. What do you own and why? Not what you'd recommend, not what you think is a good idea. What is actually there, and can you say the reason out loud in a sentence, without using a word you got from somebody selling something? If you can't answer it, that's not a failure. It's just the most useful thing you could find out today. Which brings us to the last chapter of the book proper, the Postscript, and it's the one most people skip. It's Housel explaining why the modern consumer thinks about money the way they do. And it's the piece that makes everything before it makes sense. Chapter 21. The Postscript. And I want to make a case for this one before we start, because it's the chapter almost everybody skips. It's tacked on after the ending, it's about American economic history, and it looks like an appendix. It isn't. It's the chapter that explains where all the feelings in the other 20 came from. Housel opens it with a thought experiment. If you fell asleep in 1945 and woke up in 2020, you would not recognize the world you woke into. Not because of the technology, because of what people expect from their lives. So let's run it forward. August 1945. The war ends, and the immediate mood in America is not celebration about the economy, it's dread. Because everyone remembered what happened after the last war, and everyone knew what had come before this one. The Great Depression, 16 million people coming home looking for jobs, and a country buried in more debt than it had ever carried. President Truman was warned of a full-scale depression coming. Everyone expected the 30s to come back. They didn't come back, and Housel walks through why, and the why is the point. Low interest rates, deliberately. Rates were kept on the floor to manage the war debt, and it turned out that cheap money did something else. It made borrowing normal for ordinary households for the first time. The GI Bill, which handed returning soldiers unprecedented access to mortgages, education, and cheap loans. This is one of the largest deliberate transfers of opportunity in history, and it created a generation who could buy houses their parents could never have bought. And then consumer credit exploded. Mortgages, car loans, credit cards, personal loans, eventually payday loans, everything took off. And crucially, interest on all of it was tax-deductible. Here's the number that reframes the modern debt conversation completely. Household debt in the 1950s grew 1.5 times faster than it did during the 2000s debt splurge. The 50s, the decade everyone remembers as thrifty and wholesome. That was the biggest debt boom, and it was faster than the one we now treat as a catastrophe. And it all got spent on the same thing. Stuff. Just under 2 million homes were built from 1940 to 1945. Then 7 million from 1945 to 1950, and another 8 million after that. Car sales, about 200,000 from 1942 to 1945, then 21 million from 1945 to 1949. That's not a recovery. That's a country being physically rebuilt around a new expectation. Now here's the part that matters most, and it's the bit Housel builds the whole postscript toward. For roughly 30 years after the war, the growth was shared. Wages rose across the income distribution at broadly similar rates. A factory worker and a doctor were both getting better off, at roughly comparable speed. And because everybody was rising together, people's expectations were set by a world where a normal job bought a normal, steadily improving life, and people measure their well-being against their peers. That's not a flaw. It's how humans work. When your neighbor's life is improving at the same rate as yours, comparison is harmless. Then, from around the early 1980s, the shape changed. The economy kept growing. But the gains stopped being shared evenly. Growth concentrated, and Housel's key insight isn't the inequality statistic. Everyone's heard those. It's this: expectations didn't reset. The lifestyle that was normal in 1955, the house, the car, the college for the kids, on one income, stayed in the culture as the definition of a normal life, long after the economics that produced it had stopped applying to most people. So you had a large group of people whose incomes had flattened, holding a picture of normal life that had been generated by a different economy, and access to more consumer credit than any generation in history. Housel's conclusion is devastating in how simple it is. People borrowed to close the gap between the life they expected and the life their income now paid for. That's not stupidity. That's not moral failure. That's a completely predictable response to being handed a set of expectations and then having the means to meet them quietly withdrawn. And now go back and look at what the earlier chapters were describing. The man in the car buying respect. The goalpost that never stops moving. Social comparison as the engine of dissatisfaction. Spending money you have on things to signal to people who aren't looking. Every one of those is a psychological description of what this postscript describes structurally. Chapter 3 tells you the goalpost moves. This chapter tells you who moved it, and when, and why it stayed where it did. Which is why I think skipping it is a mistake. Without it, the book reads as 20 chapters of Manage Your Own Head Better. With it, you can see that a good deal of the head management is being done against a current that was generated by real economic history and is still flowing. Now, my honest note, this is a specifically American story. The GI Bill, the suburbs, that exact shape of post-war boom. That's the United States. If you're watching from Britain or India or anywhere else, the details don't transfer. But the mechanism absolutely does, and I'd argue it's close to universal now. A generation forms its expectations in one set of economic conditions. The conditions change, the expectations don't, and credit fills the gap. You can run that template against almost any country in the last 40 years, and it fits. And it explains something the earlier chapters can't fully account for on their own. Why the psychological problems in this book are so much worse now than they were. It isn't that people got greedier, it's that the distance between the expected life and the affordable one got wider, and there's a whole industry set up to lend you the difference. So, the question for this one: where did your idea of a normal life come from? The house, the car, the holidays, the timeline for having children, what you should have achieved by now, because you didn't derive that from your own income. Almost nobody does. You inherited it, from your parents, from television, from a decade you may not even have lived through. And then, is that picture calibrated to an economy that still exists? Because if it isn't, if you're measuring yourself against a standard generated by a set of conditions that ended before you started working, then a lot of what you've been reading as personal failure is arithmetic. That's not an excuse, and it doesn't pay anybody's bills. But it's a much more accurate map than the one most people are using, and having an accurate map is the only reason any of this is worth 3 hours. Which brings us to the last chapter. And this one isn't in the book. The honest chapter, the book everyone quotes and nobody uses. So I want to tell you about a specific thing I've watched happen, maybe a dozen times, and I've done it myself. Someone reads this book. They love it. It's genuinely one of the best-liked books of the last decade, and people don't just like it, they evangelize. It gets pressed into hands, it gets quoted at dinner, it turns up in group chats. And then you check in with that person 18 months later, and their savings rate is the same, their spending is the same, the car is the same car. Nothing in their financial life has moved a single inch, but they can still quote it. Wealth is what you don't see. Nothing's free. No one's crazy. Word perfect. I've done this. I read this book, loved it, told people about it, and then went out and bought something I did not need in order to feel a specific way about myself. So let's talk about why that happens, because I don't think it's a failure of the reader. I think it's built into the book. Here's the case against, and I want to give it properly, because a critique that isn't tempted by the thing isn't worth much. 1. It is the most quotable and the least actionable of the 3 books we've now done on this channel. Go back through everything we've just covered. Almost every chapter ends in an observation, not an instruction. Wealth is invisible, nobody's crazy. Room for error is underrated, tails drive everything. They're all true. They're all beautifully put. And almost none of them tell you what to do on Monday. Compare that to Covey, who gives you a quadrant and tells you to go and live in quadrant 2. Or Carnegie, who says, for the next 30 days, don't criticize anyone. Those are procedures. You can fail at them, which means you can also do them. Housel's honest position is that behavior beats maths. And then he gives you almost no procedure for changing behavior. Now, in his defense, that's partly because there isn't one, and pretending otherwise is what every worse money book does. But it does mean the book has a strange property. It changes how you see money without necessarily changing what you do with it. And seeing differently feels so much like progress that you can mistake it for the real thing for years. 2. The survivorship problem, and it starts on page 1. The book opens on Ronald Reed. Janitor, petrol station attendant, $8 million, patched his coat with safety pins. It's a wonderful story. It's also statistically a lottery ticket with a moral attached, because there were millions of people in Ronald Reagan's economic position over that period. The overwhelming majority of them did not end up with $8 million. Many of them saved diligently for 40 years and ended up with a modest pension and a paid-off house, which is a fine outcome and not a book. Reagan's result required decades of a rising American stock market, no catastrophic medical bill, no divorce, no unemployment stretch that forced him to sell, and a very long life. Remove any one of those and the story doesn't exist. And here's the sharp version of the objection, the book that spends a whole chapter warning you not to learn from outliers opens by teaching you with one. Chapter 2 told us, correctly, to be careful about studying extremes, because luck and risk did the heaviest lifting at both ends. And the book's own framing device is a man at the extreme end. Housel would probably say, Read isn't there to be copied, he's there to demonstrate that behavior beats income. Fair. But it's the story everyone repeats, and it functions in the culture as an aspiration, and I've never once heard someone cite the millions who did the same thing and got an ordinary result. 3. And this is the big one, the flaw. There's a qualifier that appears in Chapter 10 and then quietly disappears. Past a certain level of income. Everything in this book lives above that line. Room for error is a superb principle, and it requires spare income. Save without a goal requires a surplus to save. Cash is the oxygen of independence, requires assets to hold cash against. Paying off your house in your 30s requires a house. Even want less, the most democratic-sounding advice in the book, is being offered to people whose problem may not be wanting, but earning. I don't think Housel is unaware of this. He's more careful about it than most. But the effect of 20 chapters of psychological framing is to make every money problem look like a psychological problem. And for a large number of people, it plainly isn't. Some people don't have a goalpost problem. They have an income problem, or a rent problem, or a healthcare problem, and no amount of managing your relationship with envy fixes a wage. There's a real risk in this genre, and this book is not immune to it. When you explain money purely through psychology, you quietly relocate every failure into the individual. If it's all behavior, then whoever hasn't got any must have behaved badly. The postscript is actually the correction to this. It's the chapter where structural forces show up, and the story stops being purely personal, which is exactly why I think it's the most underread chapter in the book, and why we didn't skip it. 4. The small one, but it nags. There's a slight sleight of hand in how the book handles being wrong. It tells you that you'll be wrong half the time, and that's fine, because tales carry you. It tells you to be reasonable rather than rational, so suboptimal decisions are fine if you can hold them. It tells you nothing is as good or as bad as it seems. Each of those is true. Together they form a system in which almost no outcome can disconfirm the advice. Did well. Tails. Did badly. Fee, not fine. Made a mathematically poor choice. Reasonable, not rational, that's not dishonesty. But a framework that explains every result is a framework you should hold a bit more loosely than this book invites you to. Now, the defense, because I think 3 of those 4 objections have good answers, and the book is stronger than the critique. The first defense is that being unactionable is the honest answer. Every book that gives you a 5-step wealth system is lying, because the steps aren't the hard part. Everyone knows to spend less than they earn. The knowing was never the bottleneck. A book that refuses to pretend otherwise is doing something more useful than a book with a checklist. Even if it feels less satisfying, the second is that the ideas are unusually load-bearing. Fee versus fine has changed how I sit through bad stretches, not just financially. Knowing that progress is too slow to notice and setbacks too fast to ignore genuinely changed how much news I consume. These aren't inspirational quotes. They're small corrections to a measuring instrument, and a corrected instrument keeps paying out. And the third, the one that matters most for this channel, is that Housel is the missing third of a set. So let me do the thing I've been building toward for 3 books. Covey, in the first episode, made the case that you cannot fix your outer life until you've fixed your inner one. Character before personality. Private victory before public victory. He was right, and he was also at times quite hard to actually do, because a private victory has no scoreboard. Carnegie, in the second, made the opposite case in practice. Don't wait to become a better person. Behave like 30 principles starting today. He was right too, and the risk in his book is that the technique detaches from any actual regard for the person in front of you. And I ended that episode by saying they aren't enemies. Carnegie is the drills. Covey is the reason for the drills. Housel is the third thing, and it took me until the end of this one to see it. Housel is the accounting. He's the one who shows you what your character actually costs you in numbers. Covey says be a person of integrity. Carnegie says stop needing to win the argument. And Housel says here is what needing to win costs you. It costs you the ability to say no, which costs you your time, which was the only thing money was ever for. The man in the car wants respect. That's a Carnegie problem. He's chasing admiration with a strategy that cannot deliver it. Why he needs the admiration that badly is a Covey problem. It's a private victory hole he's trying to fill from the outside. And what it costs him is the Housel chapter. The payment, the constraint, the job he can't leave, the years of his life sold at a price he never looked at. Same man. 3 books, 3 different instruments pointed at the same failure. That's the argument for doing them in this order, and it's the reason I don't think any one of these books is complete on its own. Now, the tests. Because I don't want to leave you with a synthesis and no way to check yourself. 3 of them, same as last time, and they're all uncomfortable. Test 1. What did your last pay rise by? Not what did you spend it on. What did it buy? In the Chapter 7 sense. Did it buy you any more control over your own time? Any more ability to say no? Any more room for error? Or did your expenses simply rise to meet it so that you now earn more and are exactly as trapped? Because if it's the second one, and for most people, most of the time it is, you have just run Housel's whole book as an experiment on yourself and got the result he predicted. The goalpost moved. You didn't notice it moving. You experienced it as, things just cost more now. Test 2. Name the thing you'd have to sell. If your income stopped this month, what's the first thing that would have to go? If you can answer that instantly, good. You know where your single point of failure is, and knowing is most of the work. If your answer is everything immediately, then the room for error chapter is not a nice idea for you. It's the only chapter that matters, and everything else in this book is a luxury you can read later. And if your answer is nothing for quite a while, then you already have the thing this book calls wealth, and you should notice that, because invisible wealth is invisible to its owner too. People with a genuine buffer routinely feel poor, because they're comparing themselves to visible spending, as Chapter 9 warned. Test 3, the hardest. Who are you still trying to prove something to? Because underneath the goalpost and the car and the ego-income gap, there is almost always a specific person, a parent, a sibling, someone from school, a version of yourself at 19 who was embarrassed about something. Housel talks about ego in the abstract, and I think that's the one place he's too polite. Ego isn't a general condition. It's usually pointed at somebody. And here's the thing, if you can name them, you can ask the only question that actually resolves it, which is whether they are watching, and the answer is almost always no. They're not watching. They haven't thought about it in years. And you have been running a very expensive performance for an audience that left. Here's the honest bottom line, and then I'll shut up. Every idea in this book amplifies whatever you already are, and that's the same conclusion I reached at the end of the last one, which I find either reassuring or depressing depending on the day. Give this book to someone who has enough, and they will feel permission to stop chasing, and their life will get quietly, substantially better. Give it to someone who is genuinely struggling, and it may just supply a sophisticated vocabulary for a problem that isn't theirs to solve, and a faint sense that if they were only wiser about envy, the numbers would work. The book cannot supply the income. It can only tell you what to do with the gap. So if you take one thing out of 3 hours, I'd make it this. And it's not one of the 20 chapters. Money buys one thing that reliably makes people happier, and it isn't things, and it isn't status. It's control over your own time. Everything else in this book is a description of the ways we accidentally sell that back. You don't need 20 principles for that. You need to notice, once, the exchange rate you've been using. Now, I'm not going to tell you what to do with any of this. Genuinely. I'm not qualified, I don't know your situation, and I don't have a plan to sell you. Maybe you go and work out your actual savings rate for the first time, which most people have never done, and which takes about 10 minutes. Maybe you pick the single principle that made you wince most in the last 3 hours and just sit with it for a week. Maybe you close this and change nothing, and honestly, that's fine. That's genuinely fine. It's your money and your life, and you know things about both that I don't. But there was a number in your head at the start of this. I know there was, because I put it there, the amount that would be enough. So before you go, one question. Not what the number is. What would you actually do with your time if you had it? Because if you can't answer that, if the honest answer is that you've never really thought past the getting, then the number was never the point, and no amount of it was ever going to be enough. That's it. That's the book.